This is Atomic Shinobi and today I'm going to narrate first part of What If Kid Naruto was burned alive. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Not wasting no more time, let's start the story.
An hour had passed since the sun had set when a small boy slipped through a library window. Even with his "kill me" orange jumpsuit on, the boy's ability to blend in was enough to get him this far without anyone noticing. The boy searched the shelves for the scrolls he had come for, as silent as death and as fast as his thoughts. In order to avoid drawing attention to himself, he slowed down and completed his task in almost an hour by using only the moonlight and starlight. He slipped back out the window after finding the scrolls he needed and sealing each one with storage seals inked on his forearms. Unfortunately, the fates had another plan for the boy, so he would not be getting away with his nighttime pastime. Two Chunin were alerted to his presence when a loose brick fell as he began to lower himself from the window. He ran toward the village's outer wall in the hopes of losing his pursuers in the forest. Knowing that his survival depended on his ability to escape, he was not aware that he was being followed from the rooftops because he ducked through alleys and remained in the shadows with a few sly glances over his shoulder. He rounded a corner in terror, only to bump into something and fall to the ground. That something ended up being a highly skilled Junin ninja with a number of his drunk friends. The man yelled, "Watch where you're going, kid!" Before squinting to see who was on the ground, the two Chunin who pursued joined the Junin's friends as they circled the boy after realizing who it was. As the group closed in on their target, hatred and rage blazed in their eyes. The man snarled, "Demon, it is long past your time." To a chorus of hateful epitaphs, some people fingered murderous weapons, while others made some out of broken bottles or other objects lying around. Dark laughter erupted as the small crowd's thoughts turned to pain, blood, death, and worse. Since you have so nicely decided to submit to your fate, the only question is how to accomplish it. The boy looks at a man behind him and makes a barely noticeable hand signal. The boy's skull was smashed by a bottle, and he suddenly felt excruciating pain followed by a growing darkness. Later that evening, when the moon had set, the boy gradually came back to, moaning in agony as he realized how badly he had been beaten after being knocked unconscious. He raised his arm to climb out after noticing that he was in a recently excavated hole. The movement made him realize his arms were broken, and he let out a cry of pain at the sound of his wounded scream. Shadows shifted above the hole, and tears started to fall. He laughed and gestured to another of the shadows as dirt started to fall on the boy. "Finally awake, I see. Don't worry, the pain won't last long, demon. After all, you will be able to never have to feel pain again." As he started creating hand seals for an earth jutsu to entomb the defenseless boy, the man smirked and said, "Enjoy your grave." A burst of energy the color of fresh blood surrounded the boy, keeping the earth away from his body as the earth wave rose up to forever shroud him in darkness. The sky was obscured from view, and the energy seemed to solidify as it became denser. Fear and stress caused the boy to faint, and neither he nor his assailants saw a change in reality as the energy pulsed faster and faster until it abruptly stopped. The energy, which now appeared to be diamond solid, remained constant for a few heartbeats before suddenly vanishing, leaving a 5-foot oval hole in the ground. The boy found himself floating in a warm green light, and his consciousness gradually began to awaken. He could feel no pain, but his wounds were still there. "Am I dead?" He felt a little relieved at the idea because it meant that the torture, hate, pain, and terror he had endured all of his life would be over. A strange, reassuring sensation that he had never experienced before started to wash over him. Had he done so, he would have discovered that it was strikingly similar to the sensation a small child gets when a mother embraces them. He felt happy for the first time in his life, and he allowed this sensation to wash over him as a gentle smile spread across his face as he fell unconscious once more. After 8 months, the boy opened his eyes slowly, blinking at the intense light glaring above him as though he were floating on water. He started to notice some of his surroundings after blinking a few times, the first being the light's source. He could see the tops of stone columns and the sun high overhead through what appeared to be the remains of a roof. It seemed as though he was in the remnants of a church. As his gaze wandered around his surroundings, he immediately found himself sinking in the water. After he moved his arm to block the sun, his still unhealed wounds protested when he splashed around, causing him to scream and start to sink again. Strong arms encircled him and hauled him up onto solid ground faster than he could register in his frantic struggle for air. He started coughing as his lungs released the liquid onto the floor as he felt the floor beneath him, finally realizing what had happened as precious air flooded back into his aching body. A soft hand patted his back. A voice that was clearly female but had a great deal of strength said softly, "Slow deep breaths, relax, you're safe now." His breathing returned to normal as he scrambled back, clutching the woman who had spoken for protection, and looked up at the people gathered around him. 3 men and 1 woman stood around him. On his left was a huge, dark-skinned man who was easily 6 feet 6 inches and had a lot of muscle. He wore a sleeveless shirt, blue jeans, and standard heavy-duty boots. A number of tiny pipes protruded from a metal cylinder at the end of the man's left arm. He was accompanied by a slender, 6 feet 0 inches young man with long black hair, dressed in black clothing with a tattered red cloak and mantle. His left forearm is adorned with a golden, metallic gauntlet. His cloak, which is secured with a number of buckles, covers the lower portion of his face. His eyes were a light shade of red. A 5 feet 2 inches woman with short black hair, a dark green sleeveless top that exposed her midriff, tan short shorts, and knee-high boots was next in line. Pale-skinned, she gave the boy a gentle smile that said she didn't mean any harm. A 5 feet 7 inches man was the fourth person in front of him. He was dressed in pants and black boots. A black shirt with armor over his left shoulder and a sleeve missing from the right covered his torso. His hair bore a striking resemblance to the boy's, both in terms of color and spikiness. He turned to examine the woman he was holding to death more closely, taking in her appearance as well. The woman's brown hair fell to the middle of her back, and she stood 5 feet 5 inches. She was wearing black shorts, a zipped-up sleeveless vest, and black and white sneakers. He cautiously let go of her and sat back, looking from one to the other to make sure they wouldn't hurt him while they waited silently for him to say something. The boy asked anxiously, "WH, who are you, and where am I?" Grinning, the big man pointed to the woman seated beside the boy. "Why don't you handle this, since he seems to like you more than us right now, Tifa?" She began the introductions by grinning at the boy. "My name is Tifa Lockhart." The large bear with the gun arm is Barrett Wallace. Next to him with the cape is Vincent Valentine. The girl is Yuffie Kasaragi. And the last in line is Cloud Strife. "As to where you are in Midgard. Now that you know who we are, why don't you tell us your name?" "Naruto Uzumaki." He smiled sheepishly as he looked at them, his face displaying embarrassment. I don't suppose either of you know where I can get a change of clothes and something to eat?" "After 2 years and 8 months Konoha. Hello, no Kuni, 8 a.m. 4 women were observed unwinding in a Kunoichi-only hot spring following an early morning exorcism. A slender girl with light brown hair, the youngest, had her hair styled into 2 buns, one on each side of her head. An older, more feral-looking girl in her late teens with dark brown hair and facial tattoos came next. An even more untamed woman who appeared to be the aunt or mother of the second girl sat next to her. These 3 were staring at a curvy woman in her mid-20s with light black hair that appeared to be glistening in the sunlight in shades of blue and purple. The dark-haired beauty had just used a cannonball to enter the hot spring, which was the cause of the glares. The woman sat back, sighing as the warmth seeped into her body, and shrugged off the glares with a smile. A well-built, red-eyed woman who was still in the changing room was told, "Hey, Ms. Frosty Panties, you better hurry up. Maybe if you soak enough of the heat up you'll find a guy that can thaw you out." She smirked as she glanced at the older woman laughing and the flushed teenagers. Ignoring the fact that they were all wet and naked, the women jumped out of the water as the water in the middle of the hot spring suddenly erupted like a geyser, ready for a fight or the weekly brutal beating of a pervert. They all looked shocked as the last of the water that had been in the air fell back down, revealing a column of green chakra. The slender teenager holding a katana and a fuma shuriken in each hand, the 2 untamed-looking individuals in a taijutsu stance, and the dark-haired one with 4 senbon ready in each hand. In the fading chakra column, the girls could see a shadowy silhouette hovering a few inches above the water as the seconds passed. When the silhouette is revealed to be a young man, about 5 feet 5 inches, wearing a cloak that resembles the 4th Hokage's but is black with crimson flames rather than white with yellow flames, the 2 older women's eyes widen in shock. He turns toward the women as soon as he senses their presence. He keeps turning his head after catching a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, not pausing to admire the nude and dripping women, instead concentrating on what has captured his attention. He speaks in a melancholy tone that the women can hardly hear, and a sad smile appears on his lips. "I'm home." Saying those words was like severing a marionette's string because his eyes instantly closed and he plunged headfirst into the water. A few seconds later, the Kunoichi sprang into action and pulled the unidentified individual from the water. Because of his death grip on the big, broad-bladed sword in his hand, the 4 of them had to complete this task. While the others dressed, while the older teen girl checked the vital signs of the unconscious boy, her mother, who was not ashamed of her nudity, stood watch until they returned so she could dress as well. After scanning him for a few minutes, the girl changed while the others bandaged some of his more severe wounds. "Where the hell do you keep those senbon at?" the oldest woman asked, looking up as the task was completed. "To hell with the senbon. I want to know where the fuck she pulled that fuma shuriken from," interrupted the younger girl with the facial tattoos. A woman wearing an Anbu costume and wearing a cat mask appeared between the two women before they could respond. Storage seals placed at the base of the fingers. More importantly though, what happened here? An Iwagakure hot spring. A man with silver hair was writing in a journal when he suddenly turned serious and looked southeast while letting out a perverted giggle. What the devil? Was just now a nature chakra burst? He thought to himself as he kept looking in the direction of the sensation. Nothing else happened for a few minutes, so he resumed his surveillance of the hot spring. Mount Myoboku, a foot-tall male toad, is backing away from his wife, his hands held protectively in front of him, perspiring as he makes a futile attempt to soothe her. The female toad proceeded to advance while brandishing a cast-iron skillet, which is every wife's favorite weapon. "Come on, Ma, I said I was sorry, and that I'd fix it right after breakfast. There is no reason to get violent." Before she swung the skillet at her husband's head with Herculean force, she remarked, "You were told to stay out of the kitchen, Pa. Now face your punishment like a man." As they turned to face each other, her swing came to a halt just millimeters from Pa's head. They both felt a concentrated amount of nature chakra denser than they had ever experienced in their long lives. They turned to face one another, their eyes full of worry. "We have to tell Ogg-sama." The Konohagakure standing just outside a third-floor hospital room with 4 Anbu and a doctor was a man in his late 60s who exuded an air of absolute authority. "This boy said he was home when he saw the monument. We have no record of him, and no one recognizes him. I want to know as much about him as we can. By the time he wakes up, run every blood test you can think of. I want to know who he is and everyone he is related to. Because of the situation, I want you to handle the testing yourself." He stated that he was speaking with a doctor before going to the nurse's station to give the orders. The doctor bowed and said, "Hi, Hokage-sama." Before he speaks, he turns to the Anbu and takes a minute to puff on his pipe. "I want this room guarded at all times. No one is to enter this room without me or the doctor present. Neko-chan, Kuma-kun, I want you two to guard his room every time your shift comes up. Taka-kun, I want you to notify Anbu headquarters about this, as well as that there are to be 2 guards inside his room and 2 outside at all times. Neko-chan and Bear-kun will take the first shift in his room. Send Squad 8 before reporting, and I want them to take the next rotation. Yagi-kun, I want you to guard this room until Team 8 gets here and has spoken to Kuma-kun and Neko-chan. Then have Anko, Sume, Tenten, and Hana report to me tomorrow after lunch with their complete and written reports until we find out if this boy is friend or foe. I want all the information we can get, and every precaution taken. Am I understood?" "Hi," is the collective reaction as the Anbu moves to obey the man known as Shinobi no Kami. Orders. He watches the slow rise and fall of his breathing for a moment before leaving, opening the door slowly so as not to wake the patient or prisoner. "Why do you resemble Minato-kun so much, and who are you?" Before he vanishes in a whirl of leaves, he ponders. He would have witnessed the boy's eyes moving in REM as the unidentified boy dreamed about his past if he had stayed for a few minutes. Flashback. Even after visiting Midgard for a month, Naruto couldn't help but be amazed by the city's size and technological advancements as he gazed over it. From a rooftop, he looks down at the passing cars on the streets below and shakes his head in amazement. He is still in awe of what has transpired, the state of the city only a few months ago, and the horrific events he had heard about with Sephiroth and Genova years earlier, even as he hears the sound of construction on a building a few blocks away. After Sid started outlining his arguments for why Naruto shouldn't wear, "Kill me, orange," he leaned back and stretched his arms before grinning at the new outfit Tifa had purchased for him. However, the thought of Sid's remarks also caused him to flush. When Sid learned that Naruto hadn't had the conversation yet, he went into considerable detail about the differences between boys and girls. Even though Naruto was aware of them, the recollection of Sid's panic when he realized Tifa was behind him, cracking her knuckles in anticipation of beating Sid to a pulp, made him laugh. When Naruto heard a sword being drawn, he turned to face Cloud, who was holding his Buster sword in his right hand and a much smaller version of the same weapon in his left. Cloud throws the smaller sword to Naruto lightly before assuming a basic stance, saying, "Since you're healed and rested now, it's time we started your training. This is going to be painful. Since I'm not the teaching type, we're going to have to do this the painful way, and you'll have to learn through experience." Naruto nods his head and attempts to mimic Cloud's posture while gulping loudly. With the sword bared in an arcing swing directed just below Naruto's ribs, Cloud dashes forward. Naruto awkwardly blocks the swing, but the force of the swing sends the back of his sword crashing into him, knocking him back Cloud size as he approaches and assists Naruto in standing up. "It's a good thing I sent Tifa out for more food and first aid supplies, cause this is not only going to hurt, but take a lot longer than I thought. By the way, that is a 9-piece composite blade with a ninjutsu in the handle. As for how to use it, let me demonstrate." Flashback: Naruto stood panting against a tree that looked almost crystalline as he stood in a forest on the northern continent, hoping that he had managed to get away from Vincent for a short while. After 6 weeks of training, Naruto realized that the term vampire was an understatement, even though he had laughed when he first heard the stories about him and how he was best described as such. The word demon was far superior. His 2 months of training with Tifa and Cloud were challenging, but they improved his muscle and patience, and he was eager to work on his agility with Vincent. That is, until he discovered that the training involved him dodging pot shots from Vincent. As bark exploded just inches from his head, he dodged swiftly to the left, barely avoiding another bullet, and his eyes suddenly widened in terror. Vincent was skilled at concealing his presence, and Naruto had not yet noticed him prior to the gun being cocked. Warning: he scanned the area from a position between a bush and a large rock, silently cursing the fact that this training was being held in a forest of glowing trees that made hiding nearly impossible. Naruto starts to perspire a lot while remaining motionless as a corpse after feeling the cold steel of a barrel's business end. After putting his gun back in its holster, Vincent leans against a rock and says, "Your skills have improved since we got here, but they are far from where they should be. Now can you tell me what you did wrong, and why you weren't able to sense me until I had the gun against your head?" Naruto sat down and scratched his head thoughtfully after turning to face him. "Judging by where the sound of the gunshot came from, I was paying too much attention to what was in front of me, and the same for when I was hiding behind the bush." "That's right. What should you have done differently?" For several minutes, Naruto sat with his arms folded and tapped his lips in contemplation before responding. "Each time I stopped, I should have been thinking ahead about where to move next. Depending on where each shot came from, I also need to stay calm so I can think instead of just fleeing randomly." "Good. Naruto, before we head back for dinner, can you tell me why it's bad to just dodge without thinking ahead?" Naruto answered slowly, uncertain if he had it correct, after giving it some more thought and surveying the space where the training had been held. "Well, I guess running randomly is okay as long as you are fast enough, since it works for rabbits, but if your enemy is faster than you or can follow your movements well enough, that won't work." Vincent noticed with a smile that the boy was starting to use his head for purposes other than a hat rack. He pushes himself off the rock and motions for Naruto to follow him before making his way to the house. "Now that you've finally figured it out, I want you to think about this in depth tomorrow, and we will discuss what you've come up with over a game of shogi after dinner. When we get back to the house, I want you to stretch and then take a hot bath to help your muscles relax. I also want you to stretch before bed too, but only light stretches. We don't want your muscles cramping up from being overstrained." Flashback: Naruto thought this was some sort of twisted joke as he slipped through a hallway, dodging the moonlight coming in from a nearby window. The objective wasn't that complicated, but his task was. He was doing well in his Wutai ninja training, but he couldn't get rid of the feeling that Godo was attempting to exact revenge on him and Yuffie for their recent game of pranks. When Naruto arrived at the target's door, he paused, wondering what he would have to do and whether he would make it out alive or not. He opened the door slowly and crept into the room without making a sound. He crept as quietly as he could, being careful not to wake her, and it took him more than a minute to reach the target. She was lying on her back, which made this easier for him, and he suppressed a sigh of relief. He pauses for a moment as he stoops to carry out the task he was given, wondering if he will live to see tomorrow and what success this would mean for future missions. He takes in her beauty and tranquility with his face inches from hers, committing it to memory before he steels himself. He puts his lips on hers as softly as he can, his breathing slowing until it's nearly impossible to tell if he's holding his breath. He moves as softly as silk and as slowly as January molasses, but he is taken aback when he feels a tongue brush against his lips. He jerks back, startled, but catches himself before he can fall back with only a faint sound. Her eyes were still closed when he carefully checked to make sure she was still asleep, but what worried him was the sly smile on her lips. Hearing her groan, "Naruto-kun," with a soft voice, he slips back out, seeing nothing else, and nearly collapses after the door is closed. He leaves the house as fast as he can while staying covert in order to inform Godo and give him a hard time about forcing him to steal a kiss from Yuffie as a test of his abilities. When she realized what had happened, Naruto began to perspire at the agonizing things Yuffie would do to him. After 20 minutes, Naruto sat down, removed the ninja mask from his head, and gave the smiling Godo a fierce look. "Mission complete. I went in unnoticed, and managed your task without waking her. I noticed a few traps, but managed to avoid them since disarming them would alert her to my presence." Good, you did well, Naruto, but you are forgetting something. Your target was Yuffie. We will have to wait until tomorrow to see if you succeeded or not." Naruto gave Godo a worried and inquisitive look at this point. "What do you mean? She slept through the whole thing?" At what the 12-year-old said, Godo's smile only got bigger. Yuffie is even more mischievous than you, or she may have been awake and thinking about the consequences you will face in the morning. I suggest you go to bed. It may be the last chance you have to sleep peacefully. With images of Yuffie playing jump rope with his intestines and the constant tricks he would fall for running through his head, Naruto swallowed hard. He slowly gets to his feet and says good night to Godo. His nervous shaking, clearly visible Godo couldn't help but take a final jab at the boy as he left the room, knowing that Naruto would not be able to sleep and would be a nervous mess by breakfast. He said, "Rest in peace." The boy shut the door on his fingers and laughed at the yelp of pain. Flashback: his 13th birthday was just a few weeks away, and it had been almost a year since he had entered this world. He barely recognized the person looking back at him in the mirror, despite the short time that had passed. He was now almost as tall as Yuffie, and his body had built up significantly. Additionally, his whisker lines had begun to lighten, becoming lighter every month. He began to question what was happening with Kyuubi. As a result, it had taken him some time to accept that the same demon that had almost erased Konoha from the map was imprisoned inside of him. After he had spoken with Kyuubi after arriving here, a faint frown appeared on Naruto's face as he started to question why Kyuubi had been acting so grumpily lately. He checked himself in the mirror again and shook his head to get his thoughts straight. Today is not the time to be unhappy. I needed to gather myself. If he were being completely honest with himself, he would say that he was relieved that they had set the date for the conclusion of his training rotation in Midgard. After all, Tifa finally succeeded in securing Cloud, and they are getting married today. He would certainly miss them, and he had just started to consider them to be the parents he never had before leaving. He smiled to himself and carefully picked up the pillow containing 2 exquisite adamantine rings with gold filigree, which represented the value and unbreakability of their relationship. End of flashback: the office of the Hokage in Konohagakure. Reading the final witness reports from yesterday's incident at the hot spring, Sarutobi sat. He put the file down after reading a section again and turned to face the Kunoichi, who was standing in front of him with his fingers intertwined. The door opened before he could say anything more, and the doctor he had been speaking to entered with a file in hand. After giving a nod, Sarutobi faced the women. "Thank you for the thoroughness of your reports, especially considering the short notice I gave you. Please continue to think about what happened in case you remember something you didn't add to the report. Until then you are dismissed." The Kunoichi looked at the file the doctor was holding, curious to see what was inside, but they kept their curiosity in check because they knew the Hokage wouldn't have dismissed them if he had wanted them to know. The doctor slid the file onto the desk and took a seat as the final one closed the door behind her. "I ran the tests you requested myself, as per your orders, and even went so far as to use one of the labs for high contagion only to ensure privacy. Honestly, sir, I am not just surprised at the results, but am in a state of complete shock. According to our records, the boy is indeed a citizen of Konoha. The interesting thing about it is that he was thought to have died over 3 years ago." When Sarutobi heard this, he was even more intrigued by the child. In an attempt to learn more, the doctor said, "His name is Uzumaki Naruto." However, the Hokage's eyebrows shot up past his hairline in surprise, indicating that this was not going to happen. After he finished speaking, he regained his composure and motioned for the doctor to go on. The results of the DNA comparison tests were the most intriguing. "I am sure I don't have to tell you the implications of this, so all I will say is that what you just reported and anything that touches it is to be considered an SS-class village secret, with not only your life but also the lives of anyone you tell and their families at stake. His parents are both listed, but regrettably, they are both dead. Uzumaki Kushina is the name of his mother. Like so many others, she was a Kunoichi of Konoha who perished in the Kyuubi attack 15 years ago. Since she was reportedly known as the Red Death, it's surprising that no one was aware of her." At this point, he noticed Sarutobi's face going pale, and his eyes were filled with worry. "Who the father is just astounding considering no one even knew he was in a relationship," he said. "To be so famous and in the public eye, yet keep such a relationship so secret that even after his death there wasn't even the slightest rumor. Says he was even more skilled than we all thought he was." Sarutobi had grown even more agitated as he listened, shaking as if hoping the doctor's next words would disprove his thoughts. Unfortunately for him, the fates seemed to dislike closet perverts like him. As you may have already guessed, his father was none other than Namikaze Minato, the Yellow Flash, and Yondaime Hokage. Hearing his worst fear confirmed, Sarutobi could only put his face in his hands and say, in a voice full of sadness and guilt, "I am too old for this shit." "I'm afraid there is more," the doctor said, forcing a cough to get Sarutobi's attention because he could tell by the Hokage's reaction that the next piece of news would not be well received. He appears to have kinship with other shinobi who are still serving the Shinobi Hospital in Konoha. In order to ensure that no outsiders would learn anything that should be kept secret, a group of 8 Anbu were exchanging information about the current shift change in Anbu sign language. They nodded to one another and then divided up, with 4 going to report to the Hokage and the others going to their designated positions for guarding Naruto. This would be the 5th rotation since the boy was admitted, and the task was becoming monotonous for some of them. Little did they know that the unconscious boy would not only change their lives, but also the lives of many people throughout the elemental nations, just as he had a certain group of people on a world they knew existed. Flashback: 4 months had passed since Cloud and Tifa's wedding, and Naruto was very happy that they had finally done it. They seemed even more like a family than before. Normally, Naruto would be overjoyed, but today he heard something that could be something he had dreamed of all his life, but he couldn't accept it because of what he had learned from Kyuubi. He was torn between wanting to jump for joy and crying his eyes out for the pain it would cause them if he did. Tifa and Cloud exchanged a look before speaking. Naruto, what is wrong? After the wedding, we discussed this and both of us believed you would be ecstatic since you are already our son in our hearts. Could you please explain your distress? You have no idea how much it means to me that you think of me as a son, and love me enough to want to adopt me, he said, clenching his eyes shut and balling his fists before responding. He bowed his head and let the tears fall freely as he said, I want nothing more than to accept this with all my heart, but I cannot. I have hoped and prayed for a family for so long. His eyes were filled with tears, and he looked at them, pleading with them to understand what he was saying. By the time a few tears had begun to soak into the carpet, Tifa had moved next to him, wrapping him with one arm and taking his hand with the other. Why, Naruto? It was heartbreaking to see the person she would always consider her firstborn son in such a state, so she asked with more than a little concern. He felt a comforting hand on his shoulder as he started to cry, hating himself for harming the 2 people he never wanted to, even if it meant losing his life. It's okay. Naruto, simply relax and communicate with us. We both worry a lot about you, please. Although it was far from the scenario he had been hoping for, Naruto took a few deep breaths and kept his head down as he spoke, not daring to look at them, and finally wiped the last few tears from his eyes after struggling with how to break the news to them. It seems that my being here is only temporary, he said, taking a few last deep breaths. My life was saved by what Kyuubi did to bring me here, but it is slowly killing him so that I can remain here. He will pass away in a year or 2, and I will go back to Konoha. At that time he wishes to impart as much of his knowledge and strength as possible before he dies. I'm not sure if it's because he feels bad about my upbringing, if he likes me, or if it's just a strange way for him to continue living. He claims that all ninjas do this as part of their profession and is only asking me for one thing. I'm not sure yet, but he said I'll find out before we go back. Cloud and Tifa looked at each other with sadness as they hugged Naruto, and in a matter of minutes, Cloud was hugging both of them as Tifa's tears joined Naruto's, and in what could have been 5 minutes, an hour, or even 5 hours, the emotional tide finally ended, leaving them all exhausted. Cloud stood up to make them some food while he was in the kitchen with Tifa and Naruto, cleaning up the mess they had made of their faces, their minds, and their hearts in a swirling mess that made them queasy, and as he sat back down, an idea that had started out microscopically small began to grow in strength as his emotions settled down, causing a glimmer of hope in his eyes that was reinforced by the fact that they wanted him as much as he did. I know I have no right to ask this with how badly I have just hurt you, but I want to stay here and be a family with you more than anything. He raised his head and looked at them with fear and hope fighting in his eyes. Would it be okay with you if I changed my name to Naruto Strife? He asked, finally gathering the courage to put his fork on the plate after they ate in silence. This small hope grew stronger with each little touch Tifa gave him and the looks of love and understanding they both gave him. Tifa's eyes were filled with tears as she gazed at Cloud, who smiled and turned to face Naruto. Cloud's eyes spoke volumes in a way that only those whose hearts are one, who have spent years together, and who have faced death together can. Cloud had a silent plea screaming in his eyes. As his dream, however short, came true, he leapt out of the chair and ran over to Tifa, Cloud enveloping them in an embrace that could pass for a death grip as he cried with joy on a level he never thought he would ever be allowed to feel. His pride and fatherly love were more evident than any other emotion aside from his love for Tifa. On their wedding day, Cloud had said the words that Naruto had been waiting to hear: we would not only love it, but we also would be honored, son. Flashback: Cloud, Tifa, Barrett, Nanaki, Vincent, and Yuffie were gathered for a special event about a mile outside of Wutai Sid. Following the last test that Vincent gave Naruto, it was decided that he was ready to learn the final step of materia training, and Cloud had brought his entire master summon type materia. Since you have done so well with your materia training, we have decided it is time for you to learn to use the summon materia. As Naruto held it, an odd thing happened as Cloud explained how to use it. Each time he held a new materia for the first time, the blue chakra that all humans have would extend from his arm, enveloping the materia before turning green and being reabsorbed into his body. After the tutorial, which covered the levels and names of the summons, Cloud pointed to a tree. "Okay. Son, as I instructed, concentrate and call forth Ifrit on that tree." With a smile that should have split his cheeks in two, Naruto turns to face the tree and focuses as instructed. "Use summon materia is very draining when you start, so don't use any higher level summons until we tell you otherwise," he said. Pushing more power into it than he probably should because this was his first time, and was eager to make his family proud, he finally felt ready. Shouting, "Ifrit," he threw out his fist at the tree. With his jaw almost touching the ground in awe, he watched the summon erupt from the ground in a massive conflagration before annihilating the tree in a massive explosion. Naruto jumps into the air yelling and laughing like crazy at doing so well, dropping the master summon materia in the process. After giving the "good guy" pose causing everyone to hold their stomachs in laughter, Naruto turns around to inspect the damage he did to the tree, only to see the tall grass catch fire and begin to quickly spread. His eyes widen in shock, and before he can think, his body is already in motion. Panicking, he raises both hands, palms facing the growing inferno, and puts more energy than he had planned into his hands and shouts, "Leviathan!" sending a massive wave of water forward, flooding the area where the fire was. The group is shocked by what they just witnessed, and Naruto turns back to them with one hand behind his head and an apologetic smile on his face before collapsing to the ground, unconscious from the massive blow to his chakra reserves. Tifa casts Regen as she rushes over to him, and they check his vitals and are relieved to see that he is simply exhausted as Vincent picks him up to carry him back to Wutai. Sid begins discussing what they should do for Naruto as a gift for using materia correctly the first time, and how awesome it must have been given that he cast a level 2 summon on his first day. When he mentions purchasing a hooker, he is violently sent face first into the ground by one of Tifa's powerhouse punches. Afterwards that evening, after a while, with Naruto safely in bed, the group had their own little celebration and planned the party. Sid took a bottle of sake and sat outside to watch the stars. Muttering to himself, he pulled back his arm ready to throw the bottle when he heard someone filling his cup, and when he looked over, he saw Yuffie, who was slightly inebriated but not hammered, with a slight red flush on her cheeks, indicating that she was drunk but not drunk. She sat down slowly, looked up at the moon, and remained silent while Sid tipped the cup to her. After 10 slow minutes, she spoke in quiet tones, giving voice to her thoughts. "I think you're right that we need to do something major for Naruto, since his first summon materia use was definitely something for the record books, but a hooker doesn't even rank high enough to be a birthday present." "Too true, Yuffie, but with all he's been through before he came here and everything he's done since, that is the only cherry he has yet to pop as far as I can tell." She licked her lips unconsciously at the topic of conversation, which Sid noticed. Sid gave voice to the alcohol-induced thought, smiling mischievously. "Well, mischievously for a man on his 4th bottle of sake. Why don't you help him into manhood? Hear me out before you decide to use that oversized shuriken of yours on me," Yuffie said, jerking her head around to look at him in surprise before he raised his hands defensively. "Don't deny it. I know you like him, and I've seen him look you over a few times as he watched you perform the splits during your morning stretches. I even witnessed his nosebleed. You two are also ninjas. Who better to teach the boy, pardon me, man, how to win over a woman than another ninja?" After a moment, Yuffie's slight smile turned into a smirk as she turned to Sid and said, "Even though you are so drunk you can't even sit up straight, you may be onto something." Yuffie stood up and walked back inside, swaying to her hips as she considered the next test Naruto would have. After 2 days on another of Goto's tests, Naruto found himself slinking through Yuffie's house. Goto had assured him that if he passed, he would have perfected his stealth training, and he had even given him the materia for steel and mug to help him with it. He sighed as softly as a spider walking along its web, fearing what would happen if she woke up, and he stole himself, slipping into the room and cautiously scanning the area before creeping closer to the bed, where the moonlight made it possible for him to see Yuffie lying on the bed with the covers kicked off. She was sleeping this night with her arms over her head and her legs spread wide, wearing a button-up shirt with only 2 buttons fastened, and a pair of panties tied at the sides. He admires the nearly nude beauty in the moonlight, as any red-blooded man would, and he carefully begins untying the panties and slipping them out from under her, wondering how he's supposed to do it without waking her. He looks at her face to make sure she's still asleep, but he sees moonlight reflected in her eyes, which were definitely fully awake. Unconsciously, he moves to step back, but Yuffie flips him onto the bed with lightning speed, and he blinks in surprise. Finding himself pinned down with her bare womanhood just inches from his face, he swallows hard, wondering why she smells of strawberries and honey as he forces his eyes up to hers, his nerves becoming even more frayed at the predatory gleam in her eyes. She slowly bends down, holding his wrists in place as she slides her body down his until their noses are almost touching, unable to blink. Naruto wonders if this is how a rabbit feels right before an eagle catches it. Yuffie then bursts into a whisper. "Time for your punishment, Naru-kun." His eyes open as wide as they can. Then he is shocked when he feels their lips meet, and then they slowly close as the kiss deepens and their hands begin to undress each other. Flashback: Naruto, who had fled from the fiends more than an hour ago, was limping toward Midgard, leaving a small trail of blood from his wounds, when Kyuubi informed him that time was running out and that he needed to hurry if he wanted to say goodbye. Kyuubi also gave Naruto the last of his knowledge he was willing to share and explained the details of the task he wanted Naruto to complete as part of their agreement: to kill a man named Madara Uchiha, but in order to accomplish this, he had to gain strength, even more powerful than the fourth Hokage, whom entire nations dreaded seeing on the battlefield. As he hurried to get to the city as quickly as possible, tears fell to the ground as he heard Kyuubi sigh regretfully and sorrowfully. "I apologize, Kid. It appears that we did not move quickly enough." Sadly, it only made matters worse because, after just a few minutes with Midgard still in the distance, Naruto heard Kyuubi say goodbye and felt the same energy he had 3 years prior. Naruto casts float after hearing these words in an attempt to accelerate himself. End of flashback: the Shinobi Hospital in Konohagakure. The Hokage entered the room a few minutes later and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the scene. Naruto opened his eyes slowly, praying that what he remembered was only a dream, and looked around, crying as he saw the inside of a hospital room he knew all too well from before his days of being happy and part of a family. Sarutobi walked slowly over and sat in a chair next to the bed, waiting for Naruto to cry himself out. After a few long minutes, the tears eventually stopped, and Naruto wiped his eyes before saying, "Long time no see, Gigi. Naruto, we believed you were dead for a long time." He lets out a deep sigh before continuing, "Naruto, we have to talk, and some of the questions I have to ask won't be easy on you if what I just saw is any indication. I hate to admit it, but it seems your life away from here was much better than it was before you left." He feels terrible about doing this to a boy who has already been through so much. "Let's get things started by you telling me what went wrong and why you left." He used Anbu sign language to order the Anbu out of the room before performing the hand seals for privacy jutsu as he spoke. After a few hours, Sarutobi pulls his pipe out of his pocket, lights the tobacco, takes a long drag, and then releases a cloud of smoke while leaning back in his chair. "You know you're not supposed to smoke in a hospital, Gigi." "True, but there is no need for concern since Uzumaki Naruto is officially dead." The following day, as Training Ground 3, Tenten was in a very foul mood. The spandex freak and his mini-clone were even worse than usual today during their morning training, not to mention the D-class mission that is the bane of all genin. Kami, how she hated that demon cat stomping toward where she was told Kakashi would be to deliver the challenge message. She catches sunlight glinting off of metal. Curious, she heads in the direction of the reflected light. Coming to a clearing, she sees Naruto shirtless and covered in sweat training with a pair of Schwango. Staying back, she watches the man that had appeared in the middle of the Kunoichi hot spring a few days ago. The longer she watches, the more respect she has for his skill as he fluidly went through the motions with a deadly grace. As she watched as Naruto's movements slowed down, she was able to get a look as his bare torso, taking note of how well muscled he was as well as the scars. When Naruto stopped in a kneeling position with his back to her, she noticed that some of the scars were fairly recent, and wondered at what caused them. As he rose, Naruto reached over his shoulder for the massive sword strapped to his back. In 2 to 3 seconds, he opened the composite sword, replacing the Schwango, and placed the large sword on his back. As his hand released the hilt, he quickly tapped the pommel, sending a ninjutsu flying 15 feet into the air. He then moved in a brief taijutsu kata, catching the short sword in a reverse grip behind his back, instantly switching to the proper sword kata. Tenten was in awe of his kenjutsu skills and drooling at the sight of his weapons in action. As the weapons mistress that she is, she immediately started daydreaming about using Naruto's weapons while her eyes never left him. As her daydreams progressed to the point where Naruto was pinning her to a tree with his ninjutsu, she suddenly snapped out of it when he slammed the ninjutsu back into the larger sword, blinking at the momentary confusion, and she stumbled back, attracting Naruto's attention. When she saw him approaching her, she panicked, recalling that he had seen her nude and dripping wet, and had searched for an escape route before she could run like a rabbit. Naruto smiled at her and spoke in a flirtatious manner. "So, beautiful, enjoy the show?" She gets up, dusts herself off, and uses the time to gather her thoughts. Your swordsmanship is impressive, but that sword of yours is awe-inspiring, she says, blushing a little more. Do you know the blacksmith who made it, and where did you get it? When she asks him questions, his smile disappears and his face becomes dejected. There are only 2 of these in the world. They can't be reached by the man who made them. We haven't introduced ourselves yet, she said, trying to think of a way to change the topic because she didn't miss the shift in tone as a genin on Team Guy. My name is Tenten. She bowed semi-formally at the waist and added, my family also owns the gun store next to Ichiraku's ramen stand. Naruto returns the bow, grinning ruefully and scratching the back of his head. My name is Naruto Strife. I arrived here a few days ago, and on Saturday I'm expected to take an academy placement test. Tenten's brows furrow in perplexity. Academy? You are easily high genin, if not chunin, in skill based on what I just witnessed. You're attending the academy, but why? Recalling his conversation with Saratobi, he shares with her the cover story they devised. They want to see how I interact with people my own age because I'm new here. Really, it's understandable. Would you, after all, put your trust in someone who appeared out of the blue and added him to the shinobi ranks without at least a trial period? She shrugs that line of thought away and smiles at Naruto, saying, since you won't know what supplies you'll need until after your exam, why don't you stop by my family's store, and I'll give you a discount? Tenten nodded, understanding his point but not understanding why he still had to attend the academy. Thank you. He rolls his shoulders and turns to pick up his equipment after noticing the sun's position in the sky and the empty feeling in his stomach. I hate to cut this short, but I need to get cleaned up and grab some dinner, he says. She quickly said goodbye, getting a promise to see him soon, and fled to the weapon shop, completely forgetting the message she was supposed to deliver. She did not realize how much time had passed since she had arrived at Training Ground 3. Naruto was disgusted, not with himself, but with the Hokage and the 2 chunin he had testing him, if you can call that a test. They had him perform the basic academy skills that almost anyone could perform by the age of 9, and they didn't have him perform any ninjutsu, taijutsu, swordsmanship, or anything else besides the basic stuff. He couldn't understand why they didn't test his skills and assign him a rank that was appropriate, so he refused to even acknowledge it as he passed her without noticing. A tick mark appeared on her forehead, and she threw a kunai at him, but what she didn't anticipate was that he caught the kunai, but the handle spun to face his would-be assassin. He grinned sheepishly upon seeing Tenten standing there. I apologize, Tenten. As he returned her kunai, Naruto remarked, I had a difficult weekend and am still a little upset about the so-called exam. Naruto-kun, it's okay. She held out the box to him and said, I just stopped by to give you the last of the supplies you ordered. Thanks, I really appreciate this, he said, smiling as he took the box and placed its contents inside the seals on his arms before returning it to her. You are aware that you were not required to deliver this. I had the option to pick them up this afternoon. No worries, Naruto-kun. I have a lot of free time today because my team took today off. In relation to that, would you like me to give you a tour of the city this afternoon? Due to the hospital stay and the examination, you most likely haven't had time to orient yourself. Sure, that sounds like a good idea, he said, smiling, thinking she looked cute with a slight blush as she ducked her eyes to the ground. Additionally, it would assist me in diverting my attention from some things. Good morning, Iruka-sensei. Naruto entered the classroom, following the instructions on the paper the Hokage had given him after his exam, stood in front of the door, pocketed the paper, and schooled his features because he was still in a bad mood. She smiled at his acceptance, didn't see the shadow of sadness in his eyes, and promised to meet him at the gate after classes before rushing off. After hearing the cover story that the Hokage and Naruto had devised, Iruka grinned at the boy and said, Good morning, Strife-san. It's encouraging to see that you had no trouble finding the class. Please introduce yourself once I have everyone's attention, alright? Iruka took several minutes to get the class's attention, and he only succeeded in doing so by using the notorious big head jutsu. After ensuring he had their attention, he told the class about the new student and gestured for Naruto to introduce himself. Naruto nodded, simply wanting to get this over with, knowing that spending time in the academy would teach him almost nothing. My Naruto Strife. Name: weight, 140 lbs. Height, 5 feet 5. Hair, blonde. Eyes, green. Age, 15. Blood type, B. It's nice to meet you. Naruto bowed formally, hoping that the information he provided would help him avoid any awkward questions. He saw Iruka gesture to a spot towards the back of the class, so he walked over and sat down. As the day went on, Naruto was reassured that he would learn almost nothing from this, with the exception of history, and when the lunch bell rang, he arrived as a relief. He spent his lunch lying in the shade against a tree, wondering how he was going to get through this without going crazy by the time lunch was over. The only thing he had thought of was imitating the boy Shikamaru and doze off during class. He was in a better mood than he had been this morning, but he was still more than annoyed by the situation. He was more than a little disgusted by the fangirl race between Sakura and Ino that morning, and he was seriously considering casting stop on them when they ran in like banshees vying for a seat next to Sasuke. As he was weighing the advantages and disadvantages of casting a materia spell on them, he failed to notice a rugged-looking boy with a puppy on his head approaching him. "What's the matter? Are they not fighting for you because they are jealous?" Kiba's motivations were straightforward. He came from a clan that was organized like a pack, and he was going to prove to the new kid that he was the lowest of the pack. Little did he know that he had just made himself an unwilling victim of Naruto's pent-up aggression, the boy said with malicious humor in his voice. Naruto swiftly assessed the boy, who had a kennel-like odor, and concluded that he lacked a great deal of threat. "Are you kidding? Why would I be envious of a gay emo who is openly gay and his pitiful, ignorant banshee whore harem? A new guy like you would never have a chance with any girl, so it would only be natural for an omega like you to be jealous of your betters," Kiba said, laughing at the names Naruto had given Sasuke and his fangirls before proceeding with his scheme. After learning a lot about nature and animal behavior from Nanaki, Naruto narrowed his eyes at the insult and grinned when he had an idea. He then spoke in an oddly humorous tone while dramatically flaring his nostrils in Kiba's direction. "Is that virgin I smell? It must be, because even if the village stray were in heat, a fleabag mutt like you wouldn't even get a second glance." Kiba was furious because, on his first day at the academy, this guy insulted the son of the head of the Inuzuka clan while also disparaging his manhood just 10 feet away from his crush. "What would you know? It's likely that you are still unaware of this distinction between boys and girls." He let out a loud growl that attracted the attention of everyone else in the room. When Naruto noticed how easily Kiba became agitated, he leaned back and spoke in a bored tone, saying, "I'll give you the short answer rather than wasting my time trying to explain things you obviously can't understand. Yes, I am aware of the distinctions between men and women. Nearly a year ago, my ex-girlfriend made sure of that." Naruto smirked as he finished glancing at Kiba. Kiba snarled, flexing his claw-like fingers. "Bullshit. I really don't like the expression on Naruto's face that said, 'I'm more of a man than you will ever be, and you will have nothing but pity from me.' Nobody like you could possibly have a girlfriend, much less engage in sexual activity." Seeing that everyone including the narcoleptic was watching with interest, Naruto casually reached into his pocket and pulled out a picture that Sid had taken of Yuffie and him in bed asleep. The picture showed the covers half off the bed, Naruto in boxers, and Yuffie wearing a halter top and panties while she was laying on her side with an arm and leg draped over him. Slowly holding it up so that everyone near him could see what the picture was, he waved it under Kiba's nose. "That is a picture of me and my ex-girlfriend Yuffie taken by my uncle Sid on our 9-week anniversary." As he spoke, his voice turned sad towards the end, not noticing the looks he was getting from some of the girls. Some of the less fanatical fangirls had already thought he was cute, and couldn't help but feel their hearts go out to him at the loss that was plain in his voice and face. Surprisingly, even the vice president of the Sasuke fan club, known more commonly as Ino Yamanaka, was one of them. Wanting to hear more, they kept quiet, silently trying to coax more information from him. The image of a nearly nude woman in such a cutely seductive pose caused Kiba's eyes to widen, and he even got a little nosebleed. He wiped the blood from his face with his head before burying himself even deeper. "Yeah, right. You probably paid for the picture, so it's just some hooker." Even Shinigami-sama was double-checking the paperwork on when Kiba was supposed to die, but Kiba laughed loudly, unaware of the overwhelming wave of killer intent aimed at him. "I bet such a whore wouldn't even fuck you no matter how much you begged," Kiba said. Naruto's muscles stood out against his skin with the force of trying to resist the urge to turn the mutt into a stain on the wall. Kiba's laughter ended abruptly when Naruto grabbed a hold of his throat, his arms shaking with repressed rage as Naruto's grip tightened, slowly cutting off the air to his lungs. Kiba could have sworn he saw the Shinigami standing behind Naruto. Naruto's killer intent grew to the point where some of the class was passing out and others were struggling for control of their bladders. "Boy, this is the only caution I will ever issue." Kiba tried to nod as he struggled to stay conscious, but Naruto threw him across the room with such force that his body left an imprint on the chalkboard, staring death in the face of Kiba's prone body. Naruto stood with his fists clenched at his sides, using everything he had to calm down at this point. Iruka hurried back into the room, checked Kiba's vital signs quickly, and looked up just in time to see Naruto sitting back down. "What took place here?" Iruka inquired, observing the terrified and appreciative glances directed at Naruto. Looking back out the window, Sasuke said indifferently, "The Dobi just got taught a lesson by the new guy." His thoughts, however, were quite different. "This Naruto seems pretty strong. I wonder if I'll finally have someone to truly test my strength against." After receiving a few affirmative nods, Iruka sighed and picked up Kiba, saying, I'm taking him to the nurse's office. I want you to read chapter 4 of Yondaime Hokage's reign while I'm away Naruto, and I will discuss this after class. When Iruka returned, he could tell that whatever Kiba did Naruto was still pissed about it, and decided to leave him alone until class was over. The time seemed to pass with a snail's pace for everyone as they could feel the rise and fall of Naruto's killer intent. Even Shikamaru, who thought everything except sleep was too troublesome, kept a careful eye on Naruto. Some of the girls, however, had their thoughts in turmoil thinking about what they had witnessed. Ino kept glancing at Naruto, wondering what had happened to the girl he had spoken of with such sadness of. She could also tell that he had cared for her deeply, and still did, if the rage he had shown when she was insulted was any indication. Near the end of class, Naruto had taken out the picture of him and Yuffie, and just sat staring at it, his face full of sadness, loss, and love. He continued to sit like this even after the bell rang signaling the end of class, his whole world consisting of the photo and the pain in his heart as Iruka gathered his papers, giving the boy a few more minutes. Several of the girls kept glancing at Naruto, talking softly to each other as the foundations of his fan club were laid. Sighing, Iruka walked over to Naruto, and sat down next to him before speaking. I can tell that Kiba's actions that infuriated you had to do with that girl. Would you mind telling me more about her and the reasons behind your decision to send one of your classmates to the hospital? After a few more minutes of staring at the picture, Iruka waited patiently, knowing that whatever was going on with the girl in the picture was very important to him. Finally, after taking a deep breath, Naruto pocketed the picture and told Iruka about his relationship with Yuffie and what had happened in the classroom, omitting the parts that were considered secret after his conversation with Sarutobi in the hospital. Iruka remained silent throughout, although his face showed sympathy as he knew many shinobi who had lost loved ones, including himself. Tonight, I will speak with Kiba's mother, the leader of the Inuzuka clan. I am aware of your struggles 15 years ago. I lost both my parents and a lover who died while on a mission. I'll tell you the truth, over time, the pain will lessen, but it will never completely go away before leaving for the Inuzuka compound. Iruka gave him a shoulder squeeze and asked whether Kiba would be able to attend class after Sume finished with him. When Naruto finally left the academy, Tenten was still waiting at the gate, pacing anxiously. After hearing about it from some of the girls in his class, she was worried that he would decline her offer to show him around Konoha, so when he heard Tenten's feet shuffle nervously, Naruto looked up and smiled sadly as he approached her. I apologize, Tenten, I had a rough day today, and I don't want to be by myself at the moment. Could you still show me around if it's okay with you? Naruto's eyes held a silent plea similar to a child wishing for the light to remain on at bedtime, but his voice was filled with sadness. I'll understand if you don't want to with my mood, and having been kept waiting so long. Naruto-kun, it's okay, I don't mind at all, Tenten said, smiling. Not wanting to make his mood worse, she changed the subject by pointing out different places and describing them. As the sun began to set, they were at the Hokage monument standing above the Yondaime Hokage's head. They stood there in silence watching the colorful sky darken. Beautiful, Naruto whispers, causing the blush Tenten had from watching the light play through his hair to deepen. Yes, you are, said Tenten, catching Naruto's attention. I'm sorry, what were you saying? He asked, wondering what she was thinking since he had missed most of what she said, thanking Kami for the lack of light as she could feel the heat from her deepening blush. She tries to think of something to say when her stomach growls loudly, laughing lightly at what he thinks her just her embarrassment at her hunger. He puts a hand on her shoulder. Since it's getting late, and you're obviously hungry, why don't I bring you a meal? Tenten didn't really care where they went because she was praying to Kami that he didn't think she was a fool, so she just nodded, afraid of what she would say next after what she'd said the last time she opened it. After they had left the Hokage monument and entered the restaurant district, she finally managed to regain her voice, saying, I know a good place that's only a couple blocks over. Staring up at Naruto, she was mesmerized by his smile and lost in his blue eyes until he spoke. That sounds great, Tenten. Naruto took her hand and began walking in the direction she had indicated, not seeing her blush because the shock had caused her to start walking slowly and to be a step behind him. She controlled herself and slightly tightened her grip on his hand, matching his pace, but her eyes would constantly dart to his face and their hands even as she kept her head forward and continued to tell him about the places they passed. It would be an understatement to say that Sume was upset. Iruka had just left after discussing with Sume what her son Kiba had done in class and how he had barely avoided becoming little more than a memory. She had called her daughter in after learning what Iruka wanted to discuss with her as a clan heir. Hana was rightfully furious and would have sent her younger brother to the hospital if he hadn't already been there. Sume was clenching her fists. Hana, let Anko and Kurenai know that I would like to meet with them at the Akamichi barbecue restaurant in an hour. Inform them that, among other things, I would like to talk to them about the potential new plaything for Anko and some of the students Kurenai might have since she will be a sensei this year. We should finish this before Kiba leaves the hospital, or else I might have to give him to Anko until he graduates." The two stayed silent as they walked along the roads instead of jumping over the rooftops to give themselves time to cool off. The sun had just begun to set when they walked in. Seeing the two women they were to meet already there, Hannah bowed to the clan head before leaving to send a messenger to the two Jonin. And when she returned to inform her mother that the messages had been sent, Sume gestured for her to follow. This was before the sun had set. "I've heard that your son was kicked in the ass today and was taken to the hospital. Did you want to speak with us for that reason?" As they took a seat, Anko inquired. Sume growled and motioned for the waitress to bring over some mead and sake. "Partially yes, and if Kiba doesn't stop acting like a fool I may just give him to you as a graduation gift, Anko-san." Anko and Kurenai looked at each other, thinking that Sume would be requesting the blood of the other boy rather than her son. Kurenai's voice was confused, and she asked what Kiba had done. "I've heard that he was the one who was assaulted." "That is precisely why I am angry with him," Sume said, flexing her fingers and making gouges in the table with her claw-like fingernails. "Uruka, his teacher, stopped by after class to explain the situation to me. To prove his so-called alpha status, Kiba had initiated a pessing match with a new kid, who was reportedly the one who showed up at the hot spring last week before he called the boy's ex-girlfriend a whore and was hurled across the room with enough force to leave his body imprinted on the chalkboard for his efforts. It was not a huge deal. It appears from Uruka's statement that his ex-girlfriend, with whom he was very close, passed away recently. If that is the case, then his reaction is understandable, and Kiba deserves what happened to him, and more." Anko laughed and placed the now clean dango stick on her plate. "If I were in his shoes, they're cleaning up what was left of Kiba with a mop." The other women placed their own orders at this point, and Kurenai had been deep in thought as the orders were placed, waiting until the waitress left before speaking. "It sounds like he isn't that smart, so perhaps you should get one of the Nara to tutor him." When she saw a couple entering, Hannah's eyes widened in surprise before drawing the group's attention and pointing to the entrance. Well, she said, maintaining her silence while listening to her superiors discuss how to be a clan head and how one should behave. As Sume gestured for the teens to join them, Kurenai elbowed Anko in the ribs, and Naruto looked at Tenten to check if everything was okay before going to the table where the four women were seated. After introductions, they all stayed silent while the newcomers gave their own orders, and Anko made the first comment while the others were evaluating what they had witnessed. "I assume you liked what you saw so much that you needed a closer look, don't you?" she said, smirking lecherously, which made Tenten flush. "Anko-san, what do you mean?" Anko was about to respond when Kurenai stomped on her foot and gave her a glare in return, but Naruto asked bewilderedly because he couldn't recall seeing them at the hot spring. "I apologize, Naruto-san." She got to her feet and bowed deeply from the waist to Naruto, saying, "I'd like to apologize on behalf of the Inuzuka clan for my son Kiba's behavior today. It's good to see your injuries have healed. He will receive the proper punishment for his actions, I assure you." "It is okay, Sume-san, but if it happens again I can promise you that his career as a shinobi will end," Naruto said, his jaw tightening at the memory of what Kiba had said before he schooled his features. "I will not permit anyone to disparage the woman who was so dear to my heart without facing any consequences." Sume looked at the adults and said, "I hope it doesn't come to that, but I can understand with how recently your girlfriend died." "She is not dead," Naruto said with a sorrowful sigh, looking down and sideways. "I don't believe she is, anyway." Tenten, who had not heard what had happened, put her hand on Naruto's and looked at him worriedly. "What happened, Naruto? Why did the two of you break up if she is still alive?" When Naruto reached the part about being hired to guard a merchant on his way to Kalm, he abruptly stopped talking and closed his eyes as if he were trying to hide from a great deal of pain. He then opened his eyes slowly and looked at each of the kunoichi at the table. His expression deadly serious. Naruto remained silent as a variety of emotions played across his face before finally telling them about Yuffie, the time they spent together, and how their love blossomed after the first time they made love. As the senior and ranking person there nodded for him to continue, Naruto paused to make sure no one could overhear him before continuing with his cover story. "What I am about to tell you, the Hokage has made an SS-class secret punishable by death, and interrogation of yourselves, your families, if you tell anyone this." The kunoichi exchanged a look that seemed to be carrying a conversation with their eyes as their eyes widened in surprise. As previously stated, I had a limited amount of time there and was subject to certain rules. My father put a seal on me when I was sent to train, which would enable me to be called back under one of two circumstances. The first was when he called me back after the threat had passed. The second was that I would be automatically called back when I turned 15 because my father had passed away. Given that October 10th was my 15th birthday, it is clear which requirements were satisfied. I had no say in when I returned because of this. Naruto's eyes harden as he inhales deeply. Not only did I lose the woman I love, but I also found out that my parents died 15 years ago, but that my twin brother was murdered on our birthday 3 years ago. Tenten's eyes were filled with tears, and she leaned over to give him a hug. It took him several minutes to speak again, as he spent that time soothing her and wiping her eyes. The reason this is an SS secret because of who my family is. Naruto Uzumaki was my brother. He took a moment to look at each kunoichi intently before explaining what made this so serious. My father, you all know. My mother, Uzumaki Kushina. Despite being an orphan himself, he was among the best shinobi this village had ever produced. His name was Minato Namikaze Hokage Yondaime Senko Konoha no Kiroi. The shock on each of their faces could not have been greater if the plates had stood up and started a conga line. Tenten looked like a pole-axed ox at the news that the cute boy she had a crush on was the son of the man that had saved Konoha from the Kyuubi at the cost of his own life. Anko leaned back and whistled before downing an entire bottle of sake. She remembered the Yondaime from when she was a child, and had no clue he had any kids, let alone a wife. She had also known Uzumaki from her time spent as one of the watchers the Sandaime Hokage had ordered to keep him safe. To learn that the boy that so many villagers had loathed was the son of the Yondaime brought a kind of self-loathing and anger that was only matched by what she felt when she thought about Orochimaru. Kurenai didn't know what to think, having learned about Uzumaki, and his being a Jinchuriki upon her recent promotion to Jonin. Her shock was mostly due to finding out he had sealed the Biju in his own son. Hana, being a medic nin, had learned of what the villagers had done to Uzumaki during her training at the hospital, and her sadness at injuries he had was compounded by who his father was. The anger she felt to Minato only increased the chaos of her current emotional state. Tsume's reaction was more schooled due to her position as clan head and council member, but it was no less shocked than the others. Even with the extra information she had as a council member, she had not known that Minato was with anyone, as he spent almost all his time as Hokage in the office dealing with village matters. Following Anko's cue, she downed her sake and waved at the waitress to bring another round. It took almost half an hour and 4 rounds of sake before the first words were uttered. But Naruto calmly finished his meal. While he waited for them to process the information, he sat quietly, observing their reactions and letting out a mental sigh at not seeing any of the hate he had become so accustomed to from the villagers as a child. Anko leaned forward, revealing a good portion of her barely covered breasts, after quickly calming her thoughts with sake, which also helped her focus on the more personal aspects of his story. So, Gaki, do you have a photo of this girl? She must have worked hard to win your heart so fervently. That is Yuffie and I on our 9-week anniversary, Naruto said, pulling the same picture from his pocket that he had previously shown Kiba and letting them view it before setting it on the table. Our best friends had gotten us tickets to a big resort. This photo was taken by a man I thought of as my uncle. He laughed a little when he recalled how angry she had been that day and how badly his back had been clawed that evening. I'm glad he mailed it to us, or Yuffie would have fed him his balls. Tenten couldn't help but feel a little depressed when she saw the gorgeous woman in the picture, who was about Anko's age and had a well-defined figure. At least I don't have to worry about my breasts being too small, since hers are barely bigger than mine, she thought, trying to maintain her optimism. Anko put the picture back in his pocket for safety while whistling. Damn, a girl twice your age is something for a child as young as you, particularly since she is such a sweetheart that I wouldn't mind taking a swing at her. Kurenai rubbed Anko's ribs and nodded her head in his direction as she saw Naruto's face darken to a dangerous degree. She gives Kurenai a sheepish look as she looks at Naruto and puts out her hands defensively, saying, Hey, that was a compliment. I simply meant that you were one lucky man to have a woman like that, and that she was really attractive. Tenten begged for a few minutes before Naruto finally gave in and sighed, saying, Just don't ever insult her again. She was a great kunoichi in addition to being a beautiful woman. There is nothing I wouldn't have done to stay with her, he said, his eyes changing to make it appear as though he was gazing off into space. She was my heart, my best friend, and the greatest sensei I ever had. When he felt someone squeeze his hand, he finally noticed the tears wetting his cheeks. He dried his face, cleared his throat, and pulled himself together. I am sorry, but I need to call it a night. He pulled out his wallet, placed enough ryo to cover his and Tenten's meal with a generous tip, and said, I had fun today, Tenten. I would have cut off my arm and laid it at her feet if she had asked me to do so. Someday, I hope, we can do this again. Hopefully with fewer tears, he concluded quietly, then waved goodbye and left for home. After a few minutes, Tsume's cough brought the kunoichi back to reality, and they discussed what they had learned in the time Tenten had spent with Naruto. They talked until nearly midnight before parting ways, and as she was leaving for home, she decided to speak with the Hokage about this Naruto strife tomorrow to find out if what he had said was true. In any case, the situation was very serious, and if it was, it needed to be handled carefully. A woman in a black short and t-shirt walked down a hospital hallway, lit by the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, and when she finally arrived, she hesitated with her hand just inches from the doorknob. She sighed deeply and opened the door to find a slightly younger woman on a hospital bed staring out of the window as she had been doing for almost a week. The older woman moved to a chair by the bed and began talking to her, even though she knew she wouldn't receive a response as time passed. Her thoughts turned inward, and she didn't even aware that her words were beginning to match her thoughts, until she was startled out of her reverie a few minutes later when the woman on the bed spoke for the first time in almost a week. Yuffie? Not wishing she had heard her, and not fooling herself with optimism, she asked. A son, our son, I've betrayed him, Yuffie said in a tone that was almost lifeless as she gazed at Tifa. Her eyes filled with pain and haunted by a loss no woman should have to endure. You can't blame yourself, Yuffie, Tifa said, leaning forward to look into Yuffie's eyes and taking her hand because she couldn't understand what she was hearing. I am aware of your strong desire to become a mother. According to the doctors, being admitted to the hospital from the end of your first trimester was the only way to have avoided it. I am aware of your suffering. I loved Naruto as though he had come from my womb, even though he didn't. I killed our son, Tifa, Yuffie said, shedding silent tears as she said, if I hadn't pushed myself so far trying to find any trace of him, our son would be alive right now. The shame is too much for me. I feel like I'm being torn apart just thinking about Naruto returning. While a part of me hopes he'll enter through that door at any moment, another part of me just wants to curl up and pass away. With a sigh, Tifa pulled Yuffie into a tight embrace while shedding her own tears. Stop this, Yuffie, she said. Finding the man you love and the father of your child is perfectly acceptable. You tried your hardest wanting your child to know his father is not a sign of weakness. Would Naruto really want to see you in this state? She spoke softly as the two women shared their sorrows. Tifa held Yuffie for a long time while the younger woman sobbed uncontrollably until she eventually passed out, at which point she laid her back in bed and sat for a while keeping watch over her before going to see Cloud. Tifa sighed deeply, hoping that Cloud was okay because he was taking Naruto's disappearance the hardest next to Yuffie. The week passed slowly, with the exception of the time Naruto spent with Tenten when she wasn't training or helping at her family's shop. He would train on the days she wasn't busy and occasionally stop by the Hokage's office to chat. On Friday, Iruka announced that they would be doing the weekly sparring matches after lunch. Sasuke was excited to see how his skills would compare to Naruto's, and Kiba thought this would be a great opportunity for retaliation, until he recalled the sensation of Naruto's hand around his throat and Tsume's warning, which his dog Akamaru repeated with a few barks. Naruto smiled in a way he hadn't since he had returned to Konoha, causing Hinata to momentarily gasp, thinking she had seen a ghost. The way Naruto smiled reminded her so much of her childhood love. It had broken her heart when Uzumaki Naruto had been declared dead, and she had locked herself in her room crying for 2 weeks. When Naruto Strife had first entered the class, she had thought her love had returned to her. He looked so much like him with the blonde hair and blue eyes. He even had the same first name. She had turned on her Byakugan, but there was none of the unique red chakra Naruto Uzumaki had. This combined with the fact he treated her as just another member of the class, and he spent so much time with Tenten, caused her to feel the pain of his loss all over again. This time she was able to deal with it better thanks to the vow she made to herself at the end of the 2 weeks she spent locked in her room. She had vowed to honor Naruto's memory by becoming a stronger person, the kind of woman he would have been proud of. Seeing the fox-like grin on her classmate's face made her heart beat just as it had on Monday. Berating herself for wishful thinking, she shook her head to clear her thoughts, and returned her attention to Iruka-sensei. The remainder of the morning passed too slowly for those who were eager for the spars, and too quickly for those who were hesitant. Despite his eagerness, Naruto was debating internally what he should do in the spar based on what little he knew about his possible opponents, and he had decided to take it easy because it seemed that few, if any, could match him. This was not his ego talking, but rather a straightforward statement of fact based on his training and the types and number of fiends he had vanquished once everyone was at the sparring grounds. Iruka went over the rules, and his assistant, Mizuka, went down a list of names to ensure that everyone was present. When there were only a few matches left, Naruto heard both his and Sasuke's names called. Then, as he took his position, he watched his opponent sneer and saunter over while his fangirls cheered him on. Naruto decided to play defensively to see just how good the supposed genius was. Iruka made sure both were ready before yelling, "Fight!" Sasuke launched a head-on attack with a right hook that Naruto slapped aside, causing the punch to go wide. Naruto then countered with a sweep, using his momentum to add speed and power to the attack, and he jumped forward, connecting with a knee to the underside of Sasuke's chin and knocking him backward. As Sasuke stood up, rubbing his chin, Naruto smirked and made a gesture that said, "Bring it." Sasuke's ire at being made fun of by the new man erupted, and he charged forward in a barrage of punches and kicks, trying to get past his defenses. This continued for several minutes, with each unsuccessful attack being blocked, parried, or dodged, until his rage finally got the better of him when Naruto landed a double palm thrust to the middle of his sternum. Sasuke jumped back, rubbing his chest as he raged in his mind. "I am a Uchiha. This should not be happening. I am an elite, and this guy is a nobody. He should be begging for mercy right now." He finally snapped when he saw Naruto snort, and decided to put the boy in his place. Running through the hand seals he had years of practice with, he inhaled deeply. When he completed the series of hand seals, he exhaled, shouting out the name of the technique, not caring that there were classmates behind Naruto, including some of his fangirls. Kaden. Gokaku no Jutsu. Naruto couldn't believe that Sasuke would endanger his classmates like this, and ground his teeth, preparing to beat some sense into this stuck-up prick. As he quickly raised his hand palm out, it began to glow with green chakra. Holding his palm toward the approaching fireball, he yelled out, "Water," sending a blast of water at the fireball. Having braced himself, he sprinted through the explosion of steam as the two attacks collided. Planting his right foot, he forcefully threw his left side forward, almost sliding as he put his left fist in the palm of his right hand. Using the full force of his momentum, he thrust his left elbow forward, adding the force from his right hand. He hit Sasuke in the chest with an elbow uppercut thrust. The force of the blow threw Sasuke back, causing him to cough up blood when he impacted the wall. As Iruka checked Sasuke over, he ordered Mizuki to take him to the nurse's office. Iruka then strode over to Naruto. His expression clearly not pleased. He watched as Sasuke's body fell to the ground with the limpness that only unconsciousness brings, and he asked if everyone was okay while steam rose off his body, causing some of the girls to drool. Those who weren't drooling simply nodded in agreement, too shocked to form words. "Naruto, what was that? It is quite excessive to have a punctured lung, 4 broken ribs, and a cracked sternum. Why did you feel the need to hurt a classmate once more?" Naruto's eyes narrowed as he savagely interrupted Iruka as he opened his mouth to chastise him further. "Why? He employed a very risky jutsu that could kill or seriously hurt a number of people here, including his own fangirls. I prevented that from occurring and rendered him incapable of putting anyone else in danger. I wouldn't have had to do that, Iruka-sensei, if you had performed your duties as required. If you're looking for someone to blame, put it on Sasuke, Mizuki-sensei, and yourself." By the end of his tirade, Naruto was practically yelling, and he stood glaring at Iruka before going inside. Iruka looked at Naruto's back, embarrassed that he was correct, and after a moment he shook himself before turning back to the other students, who were visibly shaken by what had happened. He sighed and told them to return to class. Naruto needed a mental break after class, so he just wandered around for a while before finding himself in the forest outside the city, where he eventually saw a massive fence enclosing trees bigger than he had imagined, and he was so taken aback by them that he didn't realize someone was standing behind him. "Gaki, isn't that impressive?" the seductive voice asked. Naruto was startled to see Anko standing there when he turned around, and before he could look her in the eyes, he remarked absently that she didn't have a bra underneath her mesh shirt today. "Yes, there. How old they must be to reach that size is beyond my comprehension. Is their safety the reason for the fence?" "No, the fence is there to keep things from getting out, not in," she said, grinning as she saw him squinting at her breasts and then laughing out loud at his question. "This is the Forest of Death, also referred to as Training Ground 44. It's the most dangerous place in my little playpen, and all of Konoha. Tell me why you are here now that you are aware of your location." The conversation then went into greater detail about the Forest of Death until Naruto said that it sounded a lot like where he spent a lot of time training. Naruto told her about the spar with Sasuke and how he had gone off on Iruka before wandering here. Lost in thought during his speech, he had to look away from Enko's assets multiple times, which only made her smirk grow. After the third time, she moved her body in a way that occasionally made Naruto notice more than just a small portion of her ample breasts. "So you think you can handle it in there, Gaki?" Enko said, laughing as she leaned forward, her trench coat hanging open a little. "Let's check to see if you can, or if your sword is simply overcompensating." When they arrived at a well-shaded clearing in the C-ranked section of Training Ground 44, she signaled a stop and sat down with her back against a tree. Originally, she was going to use him as cannon fodder for her humor, but she decided to learn more about this boy when she could feel more than just that he was angry, hurt, sad, and a variety of other emotions. Despite all of that, he was still very aware of his surroundings and had demonstrated considerable skill for someone of his age. "Gaki, take a break. Why don't you tell me what's causing your bad mood now that I've shown you a few pieces of my own playground?" Naruto sat down a few feet away from her and gazed up at the sky in contemplation. After a few minutes, he made the decision to share with her some of his story and what had happened at the academy. He knew he could trust her to some extent because she was one of the few people who had truly helped him escape from the mobs when he was younger, even if she was unaware that it had been him. His words came out angry at first, telling her about the spar and how he had to protect his classmates from the Uchiha Teme. His words came more slowly, and the heat left his voice as he described how it had brought back memories of his training. He was sad and hurt when he explained that those same memories were linked to his ex-girlfriend Yuffie. Anko had been listening and cracking jokes until she heard the agony in his voice, and it struck a chord in her, having felt much the same way years ago when she had been betrayed by Orochimaru. Oddly, she found herself drawn to the boy when he began speaking of Yuffie, and could hear the love he still had for her clear in his voice despite the emotional pain he was in. As his story ended, she found much to her surprise that she had tears running down her cheeks. Who would have thought that he would have been able to break through the mask she held so tightly just by hearing his story? She spent the next few minutes lost in thought of her own past with Orochimaru, how the village treated her after his betrayal, and of her only true friend. As she came back to reality, she noticed Naruto looking at her, and was shocked to see that he was looking at her with similar pain, the same fragile hope she had when she first confided in Kurenai, and most of all understanding. Seeing him silently looking at her like this broke the last vestiges of her mask, causing her to pull him into a hug, burying his face into her chest, telling him of her own past. Between sobs, Naruto simply listened to her, gently rubbing her back, and shedding tears of his own as she told her story as a bond formed between them, the likes of which can only be shared by people who have known such hardships as they have. After the emotional storm passed, they sat shoulder to shoulder beneath the enormous tree and continued to talk. Though they were only exchanging words, they both felt lighter than they had in a long time, but Naruto's apologetic smile was prompted by the sudden growl of a stomach, which interrupted their conversation. "Sorry, Anko-chan, we've been here longer than I anticipated, I suppose." Anko smiled and waved the apology away, saying, "No need to be sorry." She looked up to see what time it was and said, "Why don't you come to dinner with me? I have an upcoming meeting with a friend. We invite you to join us." After giving it some thought, Naruto replied, "Yes." He stood up and extended his hand to help her up, saying, "Plus it's not every day I get asked to dinner by such a beautiful woman. I haven't enjoyed a meal with a good friend in a long time." They arrived at their destination in about half an hour, laughing as Anko took his hand before being pulled up. The doorman was about to turn Naruto away because the place was reserved for upper echelon shinobi only, but after a brief conversation with Anko, he allowed him to sit at a table and they continued to talk while they waited for Anko's friend to arrive. After only 15 minutes, an attractive woman, standing 5 feet 6 inches tall, approached their table. She was dressed in mesh armor, a red blouse that showed only the right sleeve, and what appeared to be bandages with a rose thorn-like pattern on it. Her hands were also wrapped in bandages, and she wore the Konoha forehead protector and standard shinobi sandals. Anko greeted her closest friend, and introduced her and Naruto to each other. Soon their food arrived, causing the conversation to slow a little. During the course of the meal, Kurenai noticed something that totally surprised her. Anko was comfortable enough with the team to actually let some of her real self show. Kurenai watched this, wondering what had happened between the two since there was no sexual tension between them. She decided to find out just who this guy was, and to get some answers from Anko. They chatted some more after their meal, and much to Kurenai's shock, she realized Anko hadn't had any sake the entire time. It was not long after this that Naruto stood up, and bid the ladies a good night. Before he left, he placed a hand on Anko's shoulder and smiled at her as he gave it a reassuring squeeze. Kurenai's eyes widened as she saw Anko give him a real honest smile. In return, she watched Naruto leave with narrowed eyes, suspicious of someone getting so close to her friend. In one day, she turned to look at Anko as the restaurant's door closed behind Naruto. "Okay, Anko, spill it." After spending several days at Training Ground 44 outside the academy, Naruto was going to a weapon shop to replace the enormous quantity of kunai, shuriken, and explosive tags he had gone through. As he pushed the door open, a bell at the top of the door chimed, and he was astounded by the quantity of weapons on display. After a few minutes of admiring the quality of the weapons, he heard a man call out behind him. "I apologize for the wait. Do you need assistance finding anything?" "Yes, sir," Naruto said, turning to smile at the man. "I wanted to get some shinobi equipment, primarily explosive, shuriken, and kunai tags." As he approached the counter, the man grinned and said, Boy, don't worry, everything a shinobi might require is here. Did you want the standard tools of the trade or something specific? He took out a piece of paper and a pencil as he was speaking in order to compile a list of the client's requirements. With a smile, Naruto took a list from his pocket and gave it to the man, saying, "This is a list I made. It includes the details and, if feasible, some of the personalized designs I would like created." For several minutes, the man pondered what would be required to fulfill the order while examining the list and rubbing his chin. Even though it will take some time because we are currently understaffed and have fallen behind on some of our orders, this shouldn't be an issue. I should be able to have them ready in roughly 5 weeks as things stand right now. Naruto crossed his arms while tapping his lips as he thought this over. While he was weighing the pros and cons of cost, time, and quality, Tenten walked out of the back of the shop. Her hair was tied tightly back, and her skin was flushed from having just come from the forge. She was wearing tight leather pants, thick leather boots, and a sleeveless vest that was tied tightly across her chest, causing her breasts to display an impressive amount of cleavage considering she was a B-cup. Naruto's eyes tracked to her out of training, not really registering what he saw. It was when he realized that his eyes were following a bead of sweat as it slid down between her breasts that he snapped back to reality with a startled exclamation. Tenten hadn't noticed him standing there, was very surprised to see her crush in her family's store. It was then that she noticed where his eyes were aimed at, and quickly covered her chest with both arms. Blushing from embarrassment, the red of her face quickly drained away as she realized she looked a mess with her hair unkempt, and her body soaked with sweat. Tenten's eyes darted around for something to clean up with until she heard Naruto's voice. "Oh no. What is he doing here? He must think badly of me after seeing this. I can't believe I didn't notice him standing there. What am I going to do?" Tenten thought, wishing she had known Naruto would be coming over so she could have showered and dressed better. He tried not to let his thoughts become too twisted, but he couldn't help but smile in admiration of what he saw. "I've gotta say, Ten-chan, sweaty is a good look for you." His words caused Tenten's eyes to widen in surprise, and she struggled to think of something to say until she heard her father laugh and rub the side of his nose. "You mean Ten-chan? It looks like my little tomboy has finally discovered her feminine side," he said, grinning at his daughter. "Did someone else assist you in discovering it?" Her face turned a deep crimson with embarrassment and anger at what her father had said. "Daddy," punching him in the arm, she yelled, "It's not like that. Naruto-kun is merely a companion." He continued to make fun of his daughter, saying, "Naruto-kun must be a very good friend then." He glanced at Naruto and saw that he was grinning admiringly at Tenten, so he decided to make one final remark. Despite her masculine habits, she is still a girl. In light of that, I'll offer you some guidance. Be gentle, go slowly, and remember to wear protection. Naruto jerked, examining Tenten's father closely, unsure whether to run, until he noticed the mischievous twinkle in his eyes. Tenten stared at her father in complete disbelief, spluttering at the sexual connotation of his words. "You shouldn't be concerned about that." With an eyebrow raised and a voice that sounded almost purring, Naruto remarked, "I know exactly how to make sure she is always more than satisfied with our time together." At this point, Tenten simply stared at Naruto with an expression that said she couldn't be more shocked if Guy had struck her in the head with a mace while he had 5 of the gates open. Her jaw was hanging open as her mind replayed what he had said, and his voice sounded to her like the promise of silk sliding across bare skin. This proved to be too much for both men, and they both burst out laughing almost simultaneously. Tenten looked between the two for a moment before realizing that they had been making fun of her, and she began to growl in rage as she finally processed that they had been playing with her. Both men raised their hands defensively as they were able to regain control. "I apologize, Ten-chan, but I couldn't help but smile at how adorable you looked. What if I treated you to dinner as a way to make up for it?" Tenten glared at her father and Naruto for a moment before sighing and shaking her head, not realizing that crossing her arms in a huff only made her still perspiring breasts more noticeable. "I would take you up on that, Naruto-kun, but I have to help out here," Tenten said. "We are far behind schedule in completing orders to help out here more. I've even asked Guy-sensei if I can take a little time off." As an idea struck her father, Naruto turned to him and said, "How about this? I'll help out here in any way I can for free after we go out to dinner." Tenten glanced at her father, who appeared to be examining Naruto, and he nodded after a brief pause, saying, "That seems like a smart idea. You can still accomplish a lot around here even if you have no prior forging experience, and if you perform well enough, I'll even give you a discount on the materials you purchased." To seal the deal, Naruto grinned and extended his hand, saying, "I think it sounds good. You can call me Naruto. Strife working with you will be enjoyable, sir." "I am Tenten's father," Tenten's father said, smiling as he shook his hand and looked at his daughter. "I'm sure it is. Saji Oroshi." He turned to Tenten and said, "You should go get cleaned up and changed after you two return. We'll talk more about the work. Wearing that out at night is not something I would want you to do. Tenten, with her arms crossed, glanced down at her clothing and noticed that it was almost like a second skin, and she was still sweating. She blushed a little, nodded, and ran upstairs, where Naruto and Roshi discussed what Naruto had ordered, going into specifics for some items, and what they were going to be used for so they could be made properly. About 30 minutes later, Tenten returned downstairs, her hair styled in the typical panda fashion, wearing a long Chinese-style dress with a slit on one side that reached mid-thigh. The dress featured a pattern of a cherry blossom tree spiraling upward, with numerous sakura petals appearing to float through the air. Naruto bowed to Tenten and kissed her hand, saying, "I am honored that you grace my presence with your beauty, Haim." He then laughed and whistled in appreciation of the location, saying, "Well, there goes any chance of getting away with a cheap meal." Tenten blushed at his behavior, particularly the suffix he used. She smiled and extended her arm to Naruto, asking, "Should we?" Before he took her arm, she asked, and they made their way to the door, but before it closed, Roshi yelled, "Don't do anything I wouldn't do." "Ah, to be young again," he said, laughing to himself, and shaking his head he picked up the notes he had taken from Naruto and went back to the forge to finish his work. Hiruzen Sarutobi sat in his office looking at the two in front of him. It had been 3 weeks since the reports started coming in about loud noise coming from Training Ground 44. At first he dismissed it as some Jonins getting over-enthusiastic with their training. The reports kept getting worse until he finally had to send a squad of Anbu to investigate after an enormous explosion that could be felt in the Hokage's tower. The report that his fingers were tapping now stated that when the Anbu arrived they saw massive destruction covering nearly a 1/4 mile, with Anko and Naruto standing in the middle of the smoking devastation. What disturbed him the most was how the report stated that Naruto and Anko were making out, and well on their way to doing things someone who had yet to graduate the academy should not be doing. Sarutobi sighed, knowing there wasn't really anything he could do to stop them, and truth be told he wasn't inclined to, considering that they both deserved to have someone in their lives that cared for them the way they apparently did for each other. Shaking his head dismissively, he took a long draw from his pipe before speaking. "Would you mind providing an explanation for your decision to completely destroy a significant portion of one of the training grounds?" Naruto scratched the back of Anko's head as they exchanged a sheepishly sly smile. "I'm sorry, Gigi, I suppose that while we were playing with the spiders, we got a little carried away." The Hokage cocked an eyebrow and sighed, wishing that he had stopped two of the most volatile ninjas in the village from training together when he first heard of it. He was too preoccupied with finding out that Naruto had told some of the Kunoichi that he was Minato's son to notice, so he let it go unnoticed. "I'm too old for this shit," he muttered to himself, hoping that Jiraiya or Tsunade were present so he could force the Hokage position upon them. He watched the two, trying to think of a way to limit the destruction they would cause, thanking Kami that Naruto's abilities were bloodline. The mere thought of Anko having such a destructive capability almost gave him a stroke. Lifting up the report, he addressed the two clearly unrepentant people in front of him. He narrowed his eyes and spoke in a stern tone, saying, "But since this happened at a training ground, and according to the report you wiped out at least one nest of the spiders, I won't officially reprimand you. I will put you both on sewer duty for the upcoming year and limit your missions to catching Tora. If I ever hear of either of you doing anything more than C-rank damage like this again, do I express myself clearly?" When he realized they both understood, he nodded to himself and waved a dismissal before glaring at paperwork. The bane of his time as Hokage, the question was asked with a great deal of murderous intent and a voice that exuded Hokage authority. Naruto paused in the doorway and turned to face the Hokage, his face full of curiosity. "Hey, Gigi. How about using a clone to assist with the paperwork? Is it prohibited by law or something?" As he reached into a drawer and took out a pen and paper, the man known as the professor looked at the boy in disbelief, wondering why he hadn't thought of it sooner. He then numbly shocked his head to clear his mind and said, "Naruto, come here." He then handed the paper to Naruto and wrote on it, saying, "Take this to the mission office. Tell them to get in touch with me if they run into any issues with it." When he saw that the paper was a mission completion form for a S-rank mission with classified details and the Hokage's signature and stamp at the bottom, Naruto was taken aback. He turned to face the elderly man, who simply shook his head, seemingly saying, "Don't ask." Naruto shrugged and walked out, leaving the stacks of paperwork on his desk for a moment before he began to make hand seals and grinned evilly. "I've got you now," he said, as multiple Kage Bunshin appeared and immediately went to work. It was quiet and very peaceful here, and Naruto needed the solitude to help him think. Naruto was sitting on top of the Hokage monument, his sword stabbed into the ground a few feet away, and he sat at the edge with one leg hanging over as the setting sun covered Konoha in gold, red, purple, and gray shadows. Naruto still hadn't decided what he and the Sandaime had discussed when he had first arrived, and he knew he had to make a decision before team placements, and even though he was tempted to say yes just to irritate the council, he knew that would be a long-term mistake. He soon found himself thinking back to his time on Gaia, and reliving his memories of Yuffie. Tenten had always loved the sight of Konoha at sunset, which is why she always watched from her favorite spot whenever she had the chance. As she walked along the trail to her family shop, her thoughts quickly turned to how Naruto had helped out at her father's shop. His assistance had been invaluable over the past few weeks, allowing her father to not only catch up on orders but also to get ahead of schedule. She soon imagined a bare-chest Naruto pumping the bellows of the forge while perspiration trickled down his well-muscled body. A few minutes later, she saw the play of muscles beneath his heat-touched skin, and how his arms flexed as he beat the heated metal. Looking like a god, she was rudely brought back to reality when she stubbed her toe on a rock. She bit back a yelp of pain, slapped her cheeks to get rid of the image, and walked the final few yards to the tree line. After walking a few feet past the last tree, she came to a dead stop, her feet seemingly rooted in place by the scene in front of her. From her vantage point, Naruto seemed to be enveloped in a halo of light with his hair practically glowing, causing her heart to race at how gorgeous he looked. She stood like this for several minutes, not even noticing the increasing wetness between her legs, so enraptured by what to her was a scene of Naruto being blessed by Kami herself. A small bit of drool escaped her mouth as she watched the last rays of light seem to caress his face. In a daze, Tenten slowly walked over to Naruto, slowly sitting next to him, and laid her head on his shoulder. Naruto was so lost in his thoughts about his past that they evoked near physical sensations in his mind. Unconsciously, his arm slipped around Tenten's waist, pulling her tightly to his side. Blushing, Tenten looked up at Naruto, only seeing the side of his face. With a slowness that was born of her mind processing not only what she was seeing, but the numerous emotions she was simultaneously feeling, her hand moved to his cheek, turning his head to her as she leaned up to kiss him. So deep had his thoughts swallowed him, he mistook Tenten for Yuffie, and returned her kiss with the same feeling that those cherished memories held. A soft green glow enveloped the two before they slowly started to rise up until they were a few inches above the ground. As the kiss went on, the passion in it rose as well, while Naruto tightened his grip, pulling her tightly to him. Tenten's arms were around his shoulders, with one hand slipping through his hair. Naruto blinked in surprise, breaking the kiss as the tight hold and tug on his hair pulled him out of memory. "Ten-chan?" As his mind battled to clear the state of fugue, he said, and at the sound of his voice, the fog was lifted, allowing her to quickly assess the situation. When the memory of the previous few moments flashed through her mind, her eyes widened in shock at floating in the air, and she instinctively slapped him across the face. Dispelling the minor float spell, Tenten retreated a few feet when their feet touched the ground in an attempt to stabilize the chaotic mess that was her mind and heart, while Naruto stood staring at her in complete bewilderment. He took a step forward, not understanding why Tenten had slapped him, and he saw that her face was red and that she was fidgeting nervously. Tenten took a few quick steps back, shaking her head, wanting to keep her distance until she realized what was wrong with herself. Naruto sighed, grabbed his sword, and placed it on his back before moving to the edge above the Yondaime's head. They remained silent, staring at each other as the sky changed from red to purple, the edge of night rapidly sweeping across the landscape. He took a deep breath and spoke sorrowfully, "Ten-chan, I apologize." With that, he threw himself off the cliff toward his apartment. Gasping in shock, she ran to the cliff only to see a soft green light briefly surround Naruto as he neared the ground. She dropped to her knees as she watched him land with the softness of a feather before he went rooftop to rooftop, speeding his way home. Tenten sat there for over an hour as night settled over the village, deep in thought as she tried to understand what had happened as well as how she truly felt about Naruto. Did he know he was kissing me? She asked herself, unsure what he meant by the questioning tone of voice he had used when he broke the kiss. Just what are my feelings about him? She thought to herself, not knowing if what she felt was love, lust, or something else entirely. Finally sighing, she picked herself up, her mind still a jumbled mess. On her way home, she considered who she would be able to talk about this with, quickly realizing she didn't really have anyone she was comfortable discussing this with. She racked her brain the whole way home, and even into her bedroom, unable to come up with an answer. As she pulled the blanket over herself, she decided to see if Guy-sensei knew of anyone that she could talk to about female issues, and fell into a depressed sleep. As graduation drew near, Naruto spent most of his time training with Anko and Tenten, as well as helping out at Tenten's family shop. It had been awkward between him and Tenten for almost a week by this point, so on this Sunday morning, just after sunrise, Naruto found himself heading to Anko's apartment to see if she wanted to train with him in the Forest of Death, or perhaps even pull a few practical jokes. He knocked on the door multiple times before it opened, and to his astonishment, there stood Anko, with her hair down, revealing that it fell to the middle of her shoulder blades. Naruto was bug-eyed as he watched her rub her eyes, and she smiled as she stretched her eyes, still foggy from sleep and sake, before jumping on Naruto and wrapping her arms and legs around him as his back thud. As she nuzzled his neck, believing she was still dreaming, she said, Naru-kun, come back to bed. After smelling the traces of sake on her, Naruto sighed and leaned back, placing his hands on her ass to prevent her from falling. Before entering Enko's apartment, he carried her quietly back to her bed and tucked her in while he considered his options, deciding to inform Kurenai of Enko's predicament before getting a bite to eat. He kissed her forehead and then crept back out, making sure not to make any noise, and locking the door behind him. Ino was heading back to her family's flower shop after delivering some flowers a customer had ordered. She was grumbling to herself about being up and about this early in the morning when she heard a loud thump. Looking around, she spotted Naruto with a woman she recognized from the times her father had brought her with him to ANBU's I&T division where he worked. Her jaw dropped when she saw the woman's arms and legs wrapped around him, seemingly naked. She was stunned that one of her fellow students from the academy, or anyone for that matter, was that close to the psycho snake bitch, as she called Anko. She stood there in shock watching the naked woman nuzzle Naruto's neck before he grabbed her ass and carried her inside. She snapped out of it when the door shut, and immediately knew she had to tell Sakura, and spread the news along the gossip hotline. She took a moment to consult the mental map she had of Konoha before running off at such speed that she left not only a dust trail, but caused a turbulent wind to follow her passing. If she would have stayed another minute, she would have seen Naruto walk back out and lock the door behind him. Unfortunately for Naruto, that since it was Saturday, the entire town would have heard about this by Monday, and as with all gossip, the tale only grew with each telling. Kakashi, as normal, was walking down the road to the memorial stone with his face buried in the infamous orange book he always had with him. Things were going calmly for the lazy elite Jonin until he glanced up at the sound of someone knocking on a door. He took a moment to study the young man with a Zanbato-style sword at what he knew to be one Mitarashi Anko's apartment. His one visible eye widened in surprise seeing the delicious-looking woman open the door in what amounted to about 2 square inches of cloth on her body. Eye smiling, he put his orange book away, and began taking notes as she jumped onto the young man. As he scribbled into his notepad, he was giggling perversely, wondering if Jiraiya-sama would use this in his next book. He was still eye-smiling as the door shut. He finished what he was writing before taking out the orange book and continuing to the memorial stone. Suddenly he was thrown into a wall, dazing him slightly. After shaking his head to reorient himself, he wondered what had hit him before he broke down crying at the sight of the now shredded pages of his precious book fluttering through the air, tears streaming down his face. He picked up the tattered remains of the cover, holding it to his chest as one would do with a loved one that had just breathed their last breath. Throwing his head back, he screamed in agony. WWWHHHHHHYYYYYYYYYYYYYYY. Ino's lack of restraint, where information that could be considered juicy was the reason Naruto was now being glared at by most of the boys in his class. This wouldn't be so bad if 1/3 of the girls were looking at him with either an expression of desire or disgust. Naruto could only look around in confusion since he had no idea what was the current main dish of the rumor mill. This had been going on for 10 minutes when he heard a familiar laugh coming from the hallway that made him wonder what Anko was doing at the academy. The hushed conversations ended as the door slid open, and a woman in her mid-20s wearing a purple skirt, a mesh bodysuit that showed she didn't have a bra on, and a trench coat that barely stopped her from being arrested for public indecency, looking around the class. As she stood in front of the desk, she wore an evil smirk before walking up to Naruto with a sway in her hips that had the adolescent boys hypnotized. Anko slipped her arms around Naruto and rested her head on his shoulder. She pouted and said, "Naru-kun, you're so mean. Why didn't you wake me this morning?" She looked around and was relieved that the class had heard the rumors and that her little game was making a difference. As this was going on, Naruto simply sighed and said in a steady tone, "Anko-chan, you do realize we are in public, right?" Using the nail of her index finger, Anko traced his collarbone while purring. "You didn't seem to mind last time, and anyway, what happened to the breakfast you promised me?" In a flawless imitation of a disgruntled lover, she inquired. Naruto shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, Anko-chan, but you were unconscious, and I couldn't wake you up in time to prepare breakfast and make it to class on time. I'm curious about where you get all that stamina from. I assumed that after 6 hours, you would have given up. How did I know you would last over 13 hours? Referring to a wager they had made on who would survive longer battling the spiders in the Forest of Death, Naruto said. At this point, the class was divided between shock, awe, jealousy, and disgust. The girls who weren't Sasuke fangirls were looking at Anko jealously as they tried to stop the nosebleeds they were getting from the mental images, and the majority of the guys were staring at Naruto as if they had just discovered their hero. Kiba was one of those who looked at Naruto with newfound respect. Shikamaru had raised his head up, watching the display with curiosity, before shaking his head and muttering, "Fusakaneo," and falling back to sleep. Ino didn't bother to cover the blood that dripped from both nostrils as she was absorbed in a 13-hour daydream with Naruto, and as they continued to watch the events unfold, unaware that it was an act by either party, Naruto's reputation quickly gained more than just a few points with his classmates. After observing the students' reactions for a few minutes, Kurenai decided to play along to see how well they handled the unexpected. Using the seduction techniques that all Kunoichi learned by the time they reached Jonin rank, she smiled and licked her lips before saying, "The only reason she lasted 13 hours is because we took turns, Naruto-kun." The class fell silent as they tried to comprehend what they were hearing, and Hinata was taken aback when Kurenai said, as she had assumed that a relationship was beginning between Kurenai and the Hokage's son Asuma. What about Asuma-san?" The girl inquired, beginning to question whether this was the same Jonin who had been employed to accompany her outside the Hyuga clan's compound. "He can't use his hands the way Naruto-kun can." Kurenai's face took on a dreamy appearance as she spoke in a husky voice after a few minutes of perverted daydreaming. Ino recalls something one of the Gossip Circle members had told her, sensing that this would be a great chance. She did not let it pass. "How big is the dragon?" While playing Guess the Truth behind the innuendo, Anko grinned and nodded her head, saying, "Let's just say the little thing is awe-inspiring." A dragon that covered roughly one half of Naruto's back and had so much detail that it almost looked real appeared when curious Hinata activated her Byakugan. "You call that little?" She blushed more than she had before her childhood crush died, and then she fainted. Ino's reaction to hearing this was to nosebleed so violently that she was flung backward into the wall. The heiress cried out in surprise, not yet realizing that everyone in the class had heard her, until she heard Kurenai giggle and saw Anko smiling like the cat that got the canary. The most feared man in Konoha, Ibiki Morino, was suddenly brought to everyone's attention from the front of the class. He raised an eyebrow at Anko before letting out a sigh and said, "Don't you have some prisoners to play with, Anko?" The woman pouted when her boss at the interrogation and torture division interrupted her fun, saying, "You're no fun." She did this for two reasons. First, she really enjoyed playing tricks on people, and second, she had grown genuinely attracted to Naruto over the time they had spent together. She stood up slowly, grinning sensuously, and said, "I'll see you later, Naru-kun," Anko said huskily before swaying her hips in a way that promised countless pleasures. Naruto shook his head to get his thoughts straight before speaking, saying, "I'm a little disappointed in you, Nai-chan." As he watched her go, thinking about Yuffie and his relationship with Anko, he decided that this was not the time to think about such things. Naruto sighed, wanting to conceal their training in the Forest of Death. "You ought to be more adept at keeping secrets." Ibiki took over the class before Kurenai could say anything. "Enough of the games, now settle down," he said with enough murderous intent to make the class instantly obey. Satisfied with the response, he wrote his and Kurenai's names on the chalkboard before turning back to the class. "My name is Morino Ibiki, and this is Yuichi Kurenai," he said. Ibiki looked at Naruto and then said in a calm voice, "You and I will talk after class. Naruto-san, Iruka-san and Mizuki-san have things to take care of, so we will be teaching this class." Lately, Anko's actions have been interesting. After a few hours and a strange exchange with Ibiki, Naruto was thinking deeply about what Ibiki had said when Tenten shouted a greeting at him, breaking his train of thought. Seeing her in a nearly joyous state, Naruto couldn't help but smile at his friend. Hoping that their relationship was back to normal, he waved a greeting as he approached, laughing lightly at her bouncing on her toes. "What's got you in such a good mood, Ten-chan?" Since their kiss, Tenten's emotional turmoil had subsided a little, but when she heard the academy students discussing what had happened in class with Anko and Kurenai, it threw them completely out of balance. She had unconsciously begun to bounce on her toes to burn off the excess energy, and when Naruto spoke, she slowly turned to face him when she saw the source of her discomfort, grinning as if he didn't care. Her temper reached previously unheard of heights, and she quickly grabbed a scroll and threw all of the kunai and shuriken it contained at Naruto, pinning him to the wall. The wood beneath Naruto groaned in protest as Tenten leaned forward slightly, summoning a halberd with a huge axe blade that was uncomfortably close to a very sensitive area. Naruto began to say, "Wah," but was interrupted by Tenten bearing down at him with what he swore was an oni over her shoulder. "What is this about you boasting about having sex with women more than 13 hours old and sleeping around with women twice your age in public?" Her voice was uncomfortably quiet as she spoke. "I have no idea what you're discussing other than Yuffie," I haven't had any sexual relations. Really? So why are the students discussing the 2 women who showed up in class, one of whom was hanging off of you? Tenten raised the blade a little, slicing deeper into the wood between his legs, and the wood groaned again. That was Kurenai and Anko, Naruto said, swallowing the hard sweat that was streaming off of him. We were discussing a wager we had placed on whether or not they would outlast me in the forest of death against the spiders. Naruto prayed fervently that she would believe him. After a long moment of staring into his eyes, hers as hard as agates, Tenten slowly withdrew her weapon and growled, I believe you, but if I catch you doing something perverted in public again, you will wish I had only castrated you. A deep breath helped her relax, and she ran her hand through her hair before smiling and turning to face him. I have some good news. He was still suspicious of her, and the abrupt shift in attitude unnerved him. What is it, Ten-chan? They're all finished. Father completed the final one this morning, she remarked, beaming broadly. At last. With a smile that matched hers, he said, I was beginning to worry that it would be after team placements before they were ready. Get moving, she said, grabbing his hand and making him quicken his pace to keep up. They soon arrived at Tenten's family's weapons shop, and she led him to a room next to the forge that was used to store the more important orders that were finished before delivery. She reluctantly let go of his hand, unlocked the door, and motioned for him to follow. The room was medium in size, with several shelves holding crates with labels ready for shipping on some of the shelves, and barrels along the walls that held the carefully packed weapons. Naruto followed Tenten to a shelf that contained the items he had specially commissioned, some of which he had even assisted in making while he was working at the shop. Tenten picked up the last of the bunch of weapons to be made, and held them out for Naruto to inspect. They are definitely the work of a master, he said, carefully wrapping them in the case that was specially made to hold them before placing them in a storage seal on his left forearm. He took them from her gently and tested their balance with a quick kata, finding them to be just as perfectly crafted as he had anticipated. I am confident that the Aburame will welcome them. The only thing left to decide is when to deliver them. Actually, I've already set up a meeting for tonight when Father told me he was going to finish them this morning, Tenten said with a smile, her pride in her family's labors evident. When he thought about how the next council meeting would go after this week was over, Naruto couldn't help but laugh. He lifted Tenten up and spun her around in a mischievous glee, which made her laugh too. When he finally put her down, Tenten leaned against his chest, concealing the flush on her cheeks, and the feel of his muscles under his shirt made her think of the strange feelings she had been having around him lately. When her stomach growled, reminding her that she had skipped lunch because of that morning's D-rank mission, she backed away from him, blushed in embarrassment, and silently cursed the Harridan for making the mission take longer than necessary. I hope that fangirl tendencies haven't taken over your diet, Ten-chan. Naruto, who detested fangirls and would have hated to see such a good friend become the embarrassment of all Kunoichi, said, you should know how unhealthy those things are. Tenten, who detested fangirls even more than she detested perverts, became even more enraged when he was compared to one. She regarded Tsunade of the Sannin as her idol, and she growled as she punched Naruto in the chest, causing him to cough from the force of the blow. That's what you get for being an asshole, Tenten said. Due to the mission my team was on this morning, I was forced to skip lunch. She crossed her arms and glared at Naruto, saying, a civilian needed her barn repaired and was not satisfied until everything was perfect. He grinned apologetically and rubbed the area she had struck. I'm sorry, Ten-chan, I was starting to believe that this village was contagious because of how many fangirls there are. Before we meet with the Aburame, how about we grab a bite to eat? Tenten, who was only marginally placated, nodded and grunted in agreement. All right, but you're buying after that statement, you owe me. Hey, hello, don't worry about the price. You choose the location, think of it as an apology. As Tenten locked up, he considered what he would say to the clan leaders over the course of the following few days. After 2 hours, they were waiting to enter the Aburame clan compound at the gates. It was not long before they were escorted inside as they waited for the clan head, who they were informed would arrive soon. Their guide offered them tea to Naruto's surprise. The clan head showed up with one of his classmates after they had been idly chatting. Naruto and Tenten stood up, bowed to the man, and waited for the clan head to give them the all-clear to go back to their seats. The clan leader used the famously emotionless tone of the Aburame to say, I am Shibi, the head of the Aburame clan, and this is my son Shino, whom I believe you already know from the academy. Naruto and Tenten also gave their introductions and thanked Shibi for the hospitality. After 15 minutes of the obligatory small talk, Shibi decided it was time to get to work. I understand the reason you requested this meeting was to discuss something you thought would help to improve our clan techniques. I am interested on how you think this is possible, considering you know now more than is publicly available, just like with any clan. After taking a deep breath, Naruto folded his hands on his lap and put down his tea. I have already discussed my plans for reforming my clan in Konoha with Hokage-sama, and as I am the last of my line I will be under the CRA. With this being the case, I want to wait until I have found a woman worthy of my heart in the position of wife of the clan head before I announce this to the council. Be this months or years away is not of concern right now. My purpose here is to try to strengthen inter-clan bonds in preparation for when I am ready to take the mantle of clan head. With that in mind, I have commissioned these as a gesture of goodwill. Tenten picked up a wooden box and brought it to Shibi. After Naruto gave him a small gesture, she dropped to her knees and opened the box to reveal its contents before examining one of the tonfas. Shibi arched an eyebrow in response. He then gave it to Shino so that he could assess it as well. These are fine weapons, Naruto-san, but how do you think these will improve my clan's combat ability? Before responding, Naruto took a sip of his tea. As you have noticed, these are not regular tonfas. Tenten and I have developed a special design specifically for the Aburame. It is well known that the Aburame have a special bond with bugs and that they use your bodies to house their colonies. It is also well known, albeit to a much lesser extent, that your clan's weakness is close combat. Taking those two factors into consideration, we have developed this as a potential solution. Hopefully this is, but the first of many. Naruto had been closely monitoring Shibi, hoping for a positive response, and was not let down when he was given the all-clear to proceed. The principle is simple. Shibi dono, the holes on the handle and ends of the tonfa are designed in such a way as to allow your bugs to travel through the tubes built into them. This serves two main purposes, the first being a solid melee capability both defensively and offensively. As a man of your combat experience is well aware of, when people are in melee combat there are many small details that are missed in the struggle for survival. With the combination of extended reach as well as the tubes built into the weapons, it would allow your clan members to place your bugs directly on your opponent in strategic spots, as well as inflicting damage at the same time. If our understanding is correct, this would also help to conserve chakra as well as cut down on the number of bugs lost in combat. I have checked the public records while researching this, and to be perfectly honest, I was appalled at the mortality rate of an Aburame who has lost his bugs to an enemy's jutsus. Naruto waited patiently for Shibi to finish speaking, letting his words sink in as he sipped his tea slowly. Tenten returned to her place beside Naruto during this quiet and smiled encouragingly at him. Shino returned the weapon to his father a few minutes later, and he put it back in the box before shutting it. Shibi asked his son what he thought without averting his gaze from Naruto. What is your input on this, Shino? The possibilities of this cannot be denied. If this does prove to be as useful as promised, it would greatly increase the clan's stature within Konoha as well as without. I would suggest having someone train with these weapons so that they can be tested in a combat environment where the results would be best displayed. Shino spoke without any emotion in the monotone the Aburame had become known for. After listening to his son stoically, Shibi nodded and gave a small crinkle to one corner of his mouth, indicating that he agreed with Shino's statement. I agree with my son on this. There is great potential for this subject, but we will have to test it to see just how beneficial it truly is. If nothing else, you have opened a new avenue of exploration to lessen our clan's greatest weakness. For this alone you have our appreciation, and if this works out I can guarantee the full support of the Aburame clan to the Strife clan. Tenten and Naruto exchanged a smile as they looked at one another, understanding that the groundwork for Naruto's future plans was being established. Following some time spent talking about plans and other weapon designs, the two excused themselves and were led away. As Naruto walked Tenten home, they discussed how they would achieve with the other clans what they had with the Aburame. He smiled as he said good night to her and made his way back to his place. Naruto and Tenten met with a number of the main Konoha clans over the course of the following 2 weeks. Despite some of the clan heads' skepticism, the majority of the meetings went well, and they decided to strengthen their clan's bonds with Naruto. Although he was aware that things could have gone more smoothly, the outcomes exceeded his expectations because he refused to use his father as leverage. In order to achieve better outcomes, Naruto and Tenten had been very busy talking about each previous meeting as well as the ones that were coming up. In fact, they were so busy that they scarcely had time for other activities. Tenten, who had to complete missions and training with her genin team, was particularly affected by this. In fact, Tenten had been so busy that she hadn't had a chance to speak with the woman Guy had told her about until they had concluded their meetings with the clan heads. If she was going to assist Naruto, she had to postpone the meeting for as long as she did. Even though she hated doing so, Guy informed her that he had set up a meeting between her and the woman 2 days after their last encounter, and she was to meet her at the Akamichi barbecue restaurant at 7 p.m. She was thrilled to be able to get the advice she sorely needed at last, but she was also terrified of the woman's reaction and sincerely hoped she wouldn't look foolish. Tenten had been nearly 30 minutes early, and she was mainly occupied with contemplating her next words. Tenten's fidgeting was not what most people would consider it to be. Her skills quickly earned her the title of Meijin Teisho no Konoha. Despite her inexperience as a genin, and as a result, her fidgeting involved sharp and pointy objects. A woman sat down at her table as she was idly spinning a kunai in each hand. She smiled as she introduced herself, saying, "Hello, Tenten. I'm Yuihi Kurenai. Made a guy mentioned you had something important you needed to discuss with me concerning feminine issues." Tenten grinned back and tucked the kunai into her pouch. "Yes, Kurenai-san, I have a problem that I was hoping you could help me with. I don't have anyone close to me that I felt I could talk with about this. That is why I asked Guy-sensei if he knew anyone that might be able to help." Tenten breathed deeply and then continued, "To be honest, my problem is of a very personal issue, and I ask that what we are about to discuss stays between us. Some of what I will have to tell you to explain the situation involves secrets that do not belong to me. Those secrets belong to someone dear to me, and who in all honesty is at least high chunin level if not low jonin in skill. I have spared with him so I know firsthand that he could destroy me without breaking a sweat if he wanted to. I have also seen him holding his own against Mitarashi Anko. Though I believe that they both were holding back quite a bit. I am not trying to threaten you, just make the situation clear should word of this get back to him." Kurenai sat quietly as Tenten talked, speculating about what this might be about but not being certain which, if any, of these were true. Kurenai was aware of a number of individuals she might be referring to, and she was quite interested in learning more about he and the secret Tenten was discussing. "You have my word as a Jonin of Konoha that anything we discuss will not go beyond us without your express permission as long as it doesn't endanger the welfare of Konoha. Before we begin, why don't we place our orders? Talking can make a person surprisingly hungry and thirsty." Hearing this, Tenten sighed with relief, relieved that Naruto would still be her best friend and not hate her in the worst-case scenario. She waved one of the waiters over to place her order while grinning at Kurenai. Tenten patiently waited while Kurenai gave her order to the waiter and started to tell Kurenai about her relationship with Naruto, including some incidents and things he said without mentioning his name. Tenten only stopped talking to take a drink or a bite of food by the time she concluded her speech about Naruto's impending CRA status and his desire for a woman deserving of his affection and role as clan mother. They were waiting for their dessert to arrive. When Kurenai realized who Tenten had been referring to, a small smile came to her lips, and she could see that the girl genuinely cared about Naruto. She had heard everything she had to say, becoming increasingly certain as the tale progressed. Even the romantic scene on the Hokage monument made her sigh wistfully, and she contemplated telling the girl that she should have wooed him instead of slapping him after the kiss. It would be an understatement to say that she was shocked by what the two teenagers were doing with the clan heads. Others 3 times their age were not very good at politics. She made the decision to remain quietly and eat the strawberry parfait she had ordered while carefully selecting her words. As she took another bite of her dessert, Kurenai noticed the girl's smile as she said, "I have to give you credit, Tenten. What you have told me is more than surprising, especially considering your age. I can very easily see you rising through the ranks very quickly, and maybe even ending up on the council when you choose to retire. You have a lot of potential to be one of the greatest Kunoichi Konoha has ever had. Between what you and Guy have told me. On to the subject at hand though, you say that you are unsure of how you feel towards Naruto. Yes, I figured out who you were talking about. Anko is a very close friend of mine, and I know Naruto very well because of that. Watching you tonight, and hearing how you speak of him, I have no doubt how you feel about him. You are in love with him. He is a good man, and a very talented one at that." Tenten asked, "Love? Are you sure? I mean, it's just not some crush or hormonal thing? He is very handsome after all." The seasoned Kunoichi was clearly surprised and anxious about the implications. Kurenai nodded her head in agreement with the girl, grinning. Kurenai couldn't help but laugh at Tenten's blush when she brought up Naruto's body. "Yes, he is very attractive, and if he were a few years older I might consider him a prospective suitor for myself. To be honest, Tenten, I have no doubt that you love him. It's obvious by the tone of your voice, the look in your eyes, and the way your body moves when you talk about him. It also helps that he has such a great body. Naruto has a lot of potential, and will go far as a shinobi and a man. He has a loving heart, but it has been wounded deeply by what has happened. It may take a while for him to truly open his heart again, but when he finally does accept another woman into his heart, he will do so with every fiber of his being. You should tell him how you feel. Don't press the issue though, tell him, and then let him make the next move. Just don't hurt him. He trusts you. After all, how many men do you know that would be pinned to a wall with kunai and shuriken, and still smile like he did with you afterward?" At this, Tenten's eyes widened and her face flushed with shame. How do you know about that?" Kurenai chuckled at the girl's uneasiness. "Anko and I saw the whole thing. We were on the roof watching the students. I am going to be a Jonin sensei after graduation, And Anko decided to accompany me when I told her I wanted to see what I was in for. There is a lot of talent in this graduating class. But that is only natural seeing as 7 future clan heads are in the same class, although there are a few I seriously hope I don't get stuck with. After listening to Naruto narrate stories about some of his classmates, Tenten nodded as Kurenai spoke. Tenten started spinning a 6-pointed shuriken as she grew anxious about Naruto's response to her declaration of love. So, you think I should tell him I love him, but what if he doesn't feel the same? I don't want to ruin our friendship over this. Don't worry, Naruto would never end a friendship over something like this. If he does turn you down, things may be uncomfortable between you for a while, but I don't think he will. From what you told me about that kiss, he has at least some feelings for you. Just tell him, and try to take it slow. After all, neither of you are ready to be parents yet. Tenten tried in vain to say, parents, I, he, we, us, kids, as she imagined herself and Naruto as a family and what their children would be like. She exhaled loudly, enabling herself to relax. What I mean to say is that I wouldn't mind having his children someday, but not for a long time. I want to prove that not all kunoichi are fangirls, and that women like Tsunade-sama are supposed to be the norm. Kurenai was pleased with the teenager and acknowledged that fangirls damaged kunoichi's reputation. She occasionally wished she could take them away so Anko and Ibiki could play with them. After finishing her dessert, she made the decision to actively assist Tenten in obtaining Naruto. She closed her eyes and sat quietly, planning how to approach this. As the pieces came together, her smile grew cunning. Tenten became uneasy when she opened her eyes because of the intensity. Kurenai bent forward and laid out the plan in detail, saying, you will need to be extremely careful about how you approach this, given how hurt his heart is because of Yuffie, but I have an idea. Here's what you do. Tenten questioned whether she could carry out what she was hearing, but then she saw what would occur if she did. She began compiling a list of the items she would need when the time came to carry out Operation Bag the Hunk, after seeing the mental images, which strengthened her resolve. Since today was graduation day, Naruto got up early. Before going to the shower, he stretched slowly. He went to the kitchen to prepare a breakfast consisting of toast, eggs, and sausage after attending to his personal hygiene needs. He checked the time after completing his breakfast and washing the dishes and discovered that he had 2 hours before his appointment at the academy. He dressed slowly and, for some reason, chose to look as though he was on a mission. He dressed and armed himself over the course of the following 30 minutes, making sure that everything was in its proper place. He had on a dark blue sleeveless shirt, black leather fingerless gloves with a metal plate on the back, black pants, black steel toe boots, a black half cape that hung from his waist, and a piece of armor with a fox head emblazoned on his left shoulder. He positioned his sword on his back with the handle over his right shoulder. After examining himself in the mirror and taking it from the corner where it lay, he grabbed his sleek silver sunglasses on his way to the door, put them on, and opened it. Once the door was locked, he put his hand in the middle of it to activate a security seal that created a barrier that prevented anyone from entering. Now that his apartment was safe, he started to stroll slowly in the direction of the academy. Despite taking his time, Naruto managed to arrive at the academy more than 20 minutes ahead of schedule. He chose to take a seat in the back of the classroom since there was nobody else there yet. He leaned against the wall and gazed out the window, allowing his memories of this place to resurface. As the other students arrived and sat down, Naruto remained in this position. Iruka and Mizuki didn't enter for a few more minutes. They quickly started calling names for the last round of testing. Since the testing involved displaying a Kawarimi, a Bunshin, and a Henge, it didn't take long. Each test lasted 5 to 10 minutes while some, primarily Uchiha fangirls, returned without a Hite 8. The majority of them passed the test and returned to the room with one proudly displayed. Since joining the class, Naruto has placed in the top 5, as evidenced by his perfect performance on the test. He returned to class with his Hite 8 dangling from his belt. Iruka and Mizuki returned to the classroom to announce the final grades after the final tests were completed, and Uchiha Sasuke was named Rookie of the Year after finishing the last-minute lectures. They dismissed the class and instructed those who passed to return at 10 a.m. on Monday for team placements. Mizuki called Naruto back just as he was ready to leave the room. I'd like to talk to you about something. Naruto, could you meet me on the roof in 15 minutes? Although Naruto didn't like the expression in Mizuki's eyes, he was interested in the reason behind this. What is this about, Mizuki-sensei? It's a private matter, Naruto. I'll explain on the roof, okay? Naruto went to the roof and sat on a bench to wait for Mizuki, saying, okay, I'll be on the roof in 15 minutes. As he entered the roof, Mizuki remarked, ah, Naruto, good to see you are here. He glanced around to make sure no one was around. The reason I asked you here is because you have earned a chance at something that hasn't been offered in years. Naruto narrowed his eyes behind his sunglasses because he didn't like Mizuki's covert behavior. What opportunity is this, Mizuki-sensei, and why be so secretive about it? Thinking he had the boy where he wanted him, Mizuki grinned. It is a secret because if it was known, everyone that graduated would want to do it. This opportunity is only given to students that have shown a talent far beyond their peers. It is a chance to advance in rank to Chunin upon graduation, one final test of your skills, and you could skip all the D rank missions, and be placed on a team of equal rank. You would be doing C and B rank mission within a week, along with a significant pay increase over someone of Genin rank. Naruto looked closely at Mizuki, trying to figure out what he was planning, his head cocked slightly to the right after talking extensively with Sarutobi, Kurenai, and Anko about the graduation. Naruto was aware that Mizuki was lying about this alleged Chunin test. He chose to comply since he knew Sarutobi would want to know what was happening. That sounds very tempting. What do I have to do for this test? Mizuki was about to rub his hands together, but he had to stop himself. It's very simple. All you have to do is get the Forbidden Scroll from the Hokage's office, and learn one jutsu from it. You will have until midnight to accomplish this. If you are successful, you will be promoted to Chunin tomorrow, but if you don't, you'll remain a Genin until you pass the biannual Chunin exams, which you won't be able to enter until you Jonin-sensei thinks your team is ready. So what do you say? Are you ready to be a Chunin? Naruto was unaware of what was happening, but he knew that whatever Mizuki had planned wasn't good if it involved the Forbidden Scroll. Leaning back and crossing his arms, Naruto considered how to handle this situation. He got up after a moment and turned to face Mizuki. I don't see any downside to this test. Either I pass and get Chunin, or I fail and things stay as they are now. I'll take the test, Mizuki-sensei. Mizuki took a piece of paper out of a vest pocket, and his smile widened. Here is the location and description of the Forbidden Scroll. At the bottom you'll see directions to the place you are to meet me at midnight. There is also one last thing. Since this test is a secret, you cannot tell anyone about it. If someone finds out, you will automatically fail. Plan carefully, and I'll meet you in 7 hours. Good luck. Mizuki returned to the building after leaving Naruto on the rooftop. Before using Shunshin to transport himself to the Hokage Tower, Naruto remained on the roof for a few minutes to ensure Mizuki was okay inside the structure. He went to the Hokage's office through the building and informed the secretary that he wanted to talk to Sarutobi about a crucial matter. She instructed Naruto to sit down while she told the Hokage. She returned to the office a few minutes later and motioned for him to come in. The secretary shut the door behind him as he entered and sat down, leaving the two men alone. Sarutobi created a shadow clone to finish the paperwork while he shifted to the couch for a more comfortable seat. So, Naruto, what is this important issue you wish to speak with me about? He asked. You're not going to like this, Gigi. You might want to activate the privacy seals for what I have to say. Observing Naruto's serious demeanor, Sarutobi took a drag from his pipe before performing the appropriate hand seals. Naruto informed Sarutobi of Mizuki's fate following the Academy's final testing after the faint glow that signaled the seal's activation subsided. The old man's eyes tightened slightly, but that was the only indication that he didn't like what he heard. I don't know what he has planned, but I think there is more to it than just getting his hands on the Forbidden Scroll. I think we should have Anbu capture him and take him to INT for interrogation. I can only imagine what Anko would do to him after hearing he tried to involve me in this. He shuddered to think that if she managed to get hold of him, a group of medic nin would have to be on standby just to keep him alive, based on what he had heard about how close Naruto and Anko had become. That's a good plan, but Mizuki has been a shinobi for over 20 years since he was so kind as to give us a forewarning of where and when he will be there. I think we should use it to set a trap for him. I want you to come back here an hour after sunset. You should sneak in to keep up appearances since we don't know if Mizuki will be keeping an eye on you now. Why don't you go get something to eat? It'll be a long night, and we have much to do. Naruto acknowledged the orders by bowing to Sarutobi. Hi, Hokage-sama. Sarutobi called out to Naruto again before he could leave. Naruto, tell my secretary that I wish to see her. Maizegakure no Jutsu helped several Anbu, Anko, Sarutobi, Ibiki, and other Jonin hide in a clearing close to the scheduled time. Naruto had the Forbidden Scroll unrolled and was standing close to a small shack on one side of the clearing. He had already dispatched multiple teams of clones to work on some jutsus that he believed would be helpful and that he had discovered in the scroll. The Hokage had already given him permission to do this. Shadow Shuriken, Shadow Kunai, Clone Explosion, and Rasengan were the jutsus that his clones were developing. Naruto was searching the scroll for a fifth jutsu because Mizuki had not yet appeared, and Sarutobi had restricted the number of jutsu he could draw from the scroll to a maximum of 5. After reading a large portion of the scroll, Naruto was honestly appalled by some of the contents and could clearly see why they were marked as prohibited. He began reading the S-ranked jutsu. After finishing the list of a ranked jutsu, he soon started to consider discussing with the Hokage the addition of quarterly mental assessments of all shinobi in active service. He was intrigued by a jutsu he discovered near the end of the scroll. Though more versatile, it was comparable to some of the materia spells he could use. He studied it for a few minutes before pulling out a scroll and writing down all the details about the creation rebirth jutsu. Naruto rolled the scroll back up until it only displayed the first couple of jutsu. After noticing that it was almost midnight and that Mizuki would be arriving any moment after finishing this, he appeared to be napping, but instead he leaned back against the shack to meditate. A few minutes later, a snake hissed near his ear, alerting him to the presence of its prey. A little while later, there was indeed the sound of Mizuki landing on a nearby branch. Mizuki said, "Hello, Naruto-kun, have you learned a jutsu to pass the test for Chunin yet?" As he descended from his treetop position, completely oblivious to the fact that he was surrounded by some of Konoha's most formidable shinobi and kunoichi. Acting as though he was waking up, Naruto slowly got to his feet and stretched before turning to Mizuki. "Hi, Mizuki-sensei, I have, but I do have a question though." To calm the teenager, Mizuki approached with a smile. "Go ahead, Naruto-kun, after your question though I'll need you to demonstrate what jutsu you learned. After all, being a Chunin is a serious thing, and I have to verify you did pass." Mizuki thought Naruto was pleased to have passed the test because of the way he smiled. Why were you planning on betraying Konoha by stealing the forbidden scroll? After all, there are many places that would welcome you with open arms for delivering it to them. Mizuki reached for a Fuma shuriken on his back and let the mask slip, his smile turning sinister. He finished saying, "It really doesn't matter, Naruto-kun, seeing as you won't leave this clearing alive," and hurled the enormous bladed object at Naruto. Naruto quickly drew his sword and easily knocked the weapon away. "You should have known that wouldn't work on me. Mizuki-sensei, have you really been paying attention to what goes on at the academy?" Naruto said casually, keeping his sword ready. "I have, Naruto-kun. You were just a little boy with no knowledge or experience. I might have had something to worry about in a few years, but now you will never have a chance to know what it is like to be a man." Mizuki chuckled as he pulled out AK both hands. Given that Mizuki was talking a lot, Naruto made the decision to try to get him to stop talking before he was captured. Naruto smirked lustfully as he went on. "Boy, I'll have you know that before I came here I had a beautiful girlfriend that was very limber. The things she would do as we laid together at night were astounding." At this, Mizuki guffawed. "Really, Naruto-kun? I doubt that there is no way a child like you could ever have enjoyed a woman's touch unless it was cheaply bought whore." The insult to Yuffie caused Naruto's eyes to narrow, and he started to slowly approach Mizuki in an attempt to take away some of the traitor's unnecessary parts, before letting INT have him. Naruto started by describing Yuffie, leaving very little room for interpretation. He even mentioned that her breasts were, well, within the just right range, not too big or small. By this time, Naruto had traveled half the way to Mizuka, who had only laughed more intensely as Naruto talked. "Let me tell you a little about the love of my life that I will never see again." Regretfully, Mizuki was only made more agitated by this, and the sound of his own laughter caused him to miss a word that was whispered. Naruto gripped his sword more tightly before using the materia spells he had learned from his family. "Haste," was the last thing he said before sprinting as fast as he could and running at Mizuki while sheathing his sword. Naruto used his right hand to slam his fist into Mizuki's stomach with a speed that would have impressed Maeda Guy. After the impact lifted Mizuki off the branch, Naruto grabbed the same branch with his left hand and used the leverage to throw Mizuki to the ground with a vertical roundhouse. Mizuki was unable to respond as Naruto pushed off the branch to deliver a spinning elbow drop while he coughed up blood, leaving him to wonder how a mere academy student could have gained such strength and speed. Mizuki screamed as he hit the ground, feeling his left lung punctured by several broken ribs. Naruto slowly raised Mizuki a few inches off the ground by grabbing him by the neck. He was about to strike with his other arm when the Hokage materialized beside him, bringing him to a halt. As he surveyed the damage Naruto caused in a matter of seconds, Sarutobi said authoritatively, "Enough, Naruto. Anbu, take him to holding cell, and have him looked at by a medic." Sarutobi raised an eyebrow when he noticed an oddly subdued Anko approach them and cup her breasts. "You did well, Naruto, and have heard the A rank pay for this mission. It is a shame he did not let out more information. It would have made interrogating him easier." As she got closer to them, he said, "Is something wrong, Anko?" She gave Naruto a worried and surprisingly insecure look when she was a few feet away from them. She had listened to his description of Yuffie and understood that despite Naruto's inability to see her again, she still had the power to win his affection. Anko realized that she genuinely cared for the attractive blonde and wanted to win his affection after hearing that in his voice even after all these months had passed. As she attempted to replace the mask of playful seductress, she slowly opened her trench coat, exposing her breasts to the object of her affection. Naruto-kun. Do my breasts put me in the just right requirements? Naruto gazed at Anko so intently that Anko's eyes began to well up with tears. He turned to Sarutobi and begged for privacy when he saw this. They were left alone in the clearing when the Hokage nodded and disappeared back to his office. Naruto approached Anko and gently put his hands on the sides of her face as the chakra signature disappeared. He slid his left hand down her neck, along her collarbone, and between her breasts until his hand was over her heart. Why don't we continue this conversation in private, Anko-chan? He asked. Naruto withdrew his hands to create a shadow clone with extra chakra, saying, matters as important as this should not be exposed to needless rumor. The clone nodded to Naruto as if feigned to be real. Before starting its mission, he picked Anko up in bridal style while grinning subtly at her. Naruto jumped into the trees and led Anko to her apartment, saying, come on, Anko-chan, we have a lot to talk about, and it's getting late. He placed her on the couch when they got to her house and gave Anko a glass of watered-down sake to calm her down. After speaking with Anko for a few hours, Naruto would hold her until her tears returned, allowing her to let loose the emotional floodgate she had been holding shut for years. He saw that she had calmed down and was breathing peacefully against his chest at around 2:30 in the morning. He assumed she was asleep, so he carried her to her bed, removed her sandals and trench coat, and covered her with a blanket. The way the moonlight highlighted her face made him smile. As he got back up, he leaned down to kiss her forehead and gently brushed some loose hair out of her face so as not to wake her. His head was suddenly in Anko's hands. As he attempted to straighten himself, he couldn't help but notice the silent plea in her eyes as he moved them to meet hers. Her tone and eyes pleaded with him for more than just his presence, and she said softly, Naru-kun, please, stay. He was unable to resist when he saw the intense emotions in her eyes, which he believed no one had seen since Orochimaru's betrayal, possibly with the exception of Kurenai. Naruto's clone traveled to Tenten's house while he was taking Anko home. When she noticed that the lights were off, the clone scaled the wall to her bedroom window. He cautiously slipped inside to avoid waking anyone. He approached the bed quietly and found Tenten lying there, wearing only a halter top and underwear, with the covers dangling from the bed. After pausing to take in the scene in front of him, clone Naruto called out to her and gave her a gentle shoulder shake. Ten-chan, wake up. Tenten opened her eyes slowly, wondering why she had been awakened while sitting up and cleaning her eyes of sleep. She questioned, Naruto-kun, what is going on? Before he could respond, clone Naruto sat on the edge of the bed. Something has come up, Ten-chan, we need to talk. Tenten moved to sit, Indian style, on her bed at the solemn tone, not even realizing she was naked. What happened that is so important that it couldn't wait until morning? Did something happen with one of the clans, Naruto-kun? Clone Naruto exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. I'm not Naruto, I am a shadow clone, and as for what happened, well, boss just got done with an A-ranked mission from the Hokage himself. Tenten's eyes widened as she heard the clone reveal that one of the academy's senseis was a traitor. Clone Naruto put his hand on top of Tenten's and gave it a light squeeze, saying, boss wanted you to know that he might be busy with the Hokage for the next few days depending on what Ibiki, Anko, and Inoichi are able to get from Mizuki Teme. I may be a clone, but I am a perfect copy of boss, and I can honestly say that having you upset is something we definitely don't want. When Tenten felt Naruto's hand on hers, she was considering the ramifications of Mizuki being a traitor and whether he had enlisted anyone else from the academy. As she listened to the clone's words, she fixed her gaze on the hand, which caused her thoughts to diverge. Her gaze slowly moved up to his face. Following the lines of his arm, she stared at him for a long time, reflecting, I am aware that he loves me, but how? According to the clone, he is an exact replica. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, Tenten was unaware of the information aspect of shadow clones and began something she might not have otherwise. Perhaps I can learn from him, or at least prepare for when I speak with the real Naruto-kun. As she considered where this might go with Naruto, she blushed slightly and said, Naruto-kun, I need to talk with you about something. Wondering what her red face meant, the clone said, you can talk with me about anything, Ten-chan, you should know that by now. Tenten inhaled deeply before beginning. She saw the clone nod, and prepared herself for her next statement. First off, I want to apologize for being so distant lately. I've had a lot on my mind over the last month. I've done a lot of thinking, and I have come to a conclusion. Please wait till I finish before saying anything. I might lose my courage if you interrupt. She looked into clone Naruto's eyes and said, Naruto-kun, I like you so much you could even say I love you. The clone was stunned by the intensity of the feelings in her eyes. He did have a strong affection for Tenten, but was it that way? Tenten kept a close eye on the clone as she considered her words. She put her hand over his open mouth and shook her head when she noticed it. Tenten chuckled to herself. I don't expect an answer now. She laughed again, embarrassed by her actions. Hell, I just told a clone that I love the original, not like he'll even know unless I tell him myself. Pathetic, aren't I? She said. Despite having years of experience as a kunoichi, she was unable to express her feelings for the man she cared about with just 3 words. Unsure of what to do, the clone simply held her hand until she began to sob and rock back and forth. The clone scooted over until his hip made contact with hers, then encircled her with his arms. It's okay. Ten-chan, you are far from pathetic. You are one of the strongest women I know. Tenten sniffed a little and her sobbing subsided. Fear and hope were fighting in her eyes as she asked, really? You don't think I'm pathetic and childish? Clone Naruto nodded and grinned at her in an attempt to lift her spirits. The clone smiled and said, you are a lot stronger than you give yourself credit for. Ten-chan, there is no way I could think you're pathetic, and as for childish, we'll just have to wait until after you give birth to answer that one. Tenten merely gazed at the clone for a considerable amount of time before making her choice. Ultimately, Naruto wouldn't be aware that it was merely a clone, correct? Grabbing clone Naruto by the shoulders, Tenten drew him in and planted a passionate kiss on her lips. 2 thoughts crossed the clone's mind after it was taken by surprise. I'm going to die, boss. I might as well enjoy this since it's his loss. The clone woke up smiling at the surprises of the night as the sun's rays came in through the window and struck his face before stroking Tenten's cheek. He turned over on his side and watched her sleep for a few minutes. She opened her eyes slowly, thinking that what had happened was only a fantastic dream, and said, Naruto-kun. She was utterly taken aback when her father knocked on her bedroom door while she was still cuddling with clone Naruto. Tenten, it's time to get up, breakfast is almost ready. Tenten's eyes widened as she glanced at the door, then at her own nude body and Naruto, and finally she squealed as she pulled the blanket over her head. At the sound, Tenten's father hurried back and hurriedly opened the door. What's wrong, Tenten? Tenten acted instinctively and pushed clone Naruto off the bed, causing him to crash into the wall and vanish in a cloud of smoke. A naked boy was not what Roshi Hisagia had anticipated seeing when he heard his only daughter scream. Before turning to face his blushing daughter, he gazed at the wall where the clone had struck. Fearing her father's reaction, she watched with the blanket drawn up to her eyes. Before returning to the door, he stood there for a moment, unable to comprehend what was happening in the room. He paused just before closing it. He closed the door and returned to the kitchen, saying mechanically, hurry up, Tenten, breakfast will get cold. As she struggled to think of what to say to her father, Tenten was perspiring and pondered whether he would notice Naruto enough to recognize him. She hurried to the door, locked it, and then leaned back against it before slipping to the ground. Her nether regions were sore when her butt hit the floor, reminding her of what had happened the night before. She smiled as she recalled the memories, believing that any punishment she was going to receive would be well worth it. In the meantime, Naruto, as memories of his clone flooded his mind, Naruto sat bolt upright. Given what his clone had done and the fact that Tenten's father had witnessed them in bed together, he growled and palmed his face, saying, son of a bitch. Looking down at Anko, who was sleeping happily and naked, he exclaimed, just great. How in the hell am I going to fix this? After getting up and cleaning up in the bathroom, he had an epiphany. He hadn't been looking forward to it and had preferred to put it off for a few years, but it would take care of any issues this circumstance might cause if the girls were on board. After hurriedly cleaning up, Naruto created a shadow clone to accompany Anko and inform her of the circumstances. After finishing that, he traveled across 1/4 of Konoha from roof to roof to get to the Hisagia weapons shop. He was contemplating how to approach this while crouching on a roof across the street when he noticed Tenten hanging the open sign on the door. With a sigh, he made the decision to finish this and then look down the street before performing a front flip off the roof. Hearing the bell chime, he entered the room and searched for Tenten. As she put some goods on a shelf, he heard her say, I'll be with you in just a minute. He approached her and stopped 5 feet away from her while she was busy with her back to him. Remembering what she had done to his clone made him smile, but he was also hurt that it wasn't him. Tenten turned to face him, blushing a deep shade of crimson, and his smile grew. She looked anxiously toward the forge where her father was and asked, Naruto-kun, what brings you here this early? With a very serious tone, he said, we need to talk, Ten-chan, there is something important I need to tell you. This surprised Tenten, who looked again toward the forge before beckoning him to follow and guiding him to the living room above the store. She crossed her legs as she sat down, but as she remembered why she was sore, she blushed and uncrossed them. Trying not to panic, she said, has something gone wrong with the clans, Naruto-kun? After grinning at her actions, Naruto made the decision to inform her of all the things that Kage Bunshin was capable of. Before we get to that, I think there is something you should know about my chosen clone jutsu. As you already know from our spars, they are remarkably lifelike, but do you know what the original purpose of the jutsu is? Tenten chose to simply shake her head in response because she was anxious about the conversation and where it might go. Information that is its original purpose, you see, when a clone is dispelled, everything it has experienced is returned to whoever created it. When Tenten realized what he was telling her, he saw her turn pale. He is aware. Oh, Kami. Now, what should I do? As her eyes darted around, she screamed in her mind, trying to think of a way to explain what had happened. He whispered, Ten-chan. To get her attention, he inhaled deeply, let it out gradually, and then went on. Tenten closed her legs, blushing deeply, and he laughed a little. I want to apologize, I am not good with subtleties, and sometimes need my face rubbed in something in order to notice it. Sorry, Ten-chan, I didn't mean for that to be an innuendo, even though it does reinforce what I am trying to say. To cut to the chase, you know what I plan for the Strife clan, and I want to know if you want to solidify what happened last night, and be one of the women I will have to marry under the CRA. Tenten gaped in surprise at his request. She knew that by asking, he had significantly accelerated the timeline because she had assisted with the majority of the planning and implementation of his plans for years. She then pondered whether she would actually be able to share him and what it would be like to be his wife. She thought for a few minutes before realizing that she could share him as long as she was by his side. She blushed as memories of their honeymoon raced through her mind and looked up at Naruto, who was simply sitting in a chair across from her, silently observing her. After making up her mind, she got up, approached him, leaned in, and gave him a passionate kiss. Yes, Naruto-kun, I will marry you. Grinning, Naruto pulled her into an embrace. You don't know how glad I am to hear that. Ten-chan, now all that's left is to talk with your father about this. When her father was mentioned, Tenten froze. She was so anxious about facing her father that she asked, can we keep certain details private? Naruto gave her a tighter hug while laughing. Don't worry, Ten-chan, we can keep our celebration between us. Tenten pulled him down into a passionate kiss. After blushing and giving him a light punch with a grunt, Naruto abruptly ended the kiss and held his head as though in agony. Concerned about his unexpected pain, she inquired, are you alright, Naruto-kun? Yeah, but I think it would be a good idea for me to lay low for a while. It seems Enko wants my blood, though I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. Naruto suddenly cracked a grin. Do you think your father would mind if I stayed here? Considering her father's response that morning, she knew it would be foolish to inquire, but she couldn't help but wonder how he would feel if he learned that she was now engaged to Naruto. She frowned as she considered how to approach her father, saying, I honestly don't know, Naruto-kun. He walked in just before your clone dispelled, and I don't know if he recognized you. Naruto took a moment to consider this before responding. Either way, I'm sure he'll figure it out when we break the news to him. I just hope he doesn't use me for target practice. Tenten let out a sigh. Realizing that he was correct, she rested her head on his shoulder and asked, when should we tell him? Why don't you tell him we have something to discuss with him, while I make something to eat? I'm sure he's at the forge by now, so I should have everything ready by the time he gets to the kitchen. She said, okay, Naruto-kun, and then gave him a quick kiss. I hope you know what you are doing. He smiled at his fiancée in an attempt to lift her spirits. He made a suggestive question, didn't I prove that last night? Tenten slapped his arm. After blushing, she said before heading out to find Roshi, yes you did, but I don't think father needs to know that. 30 minutes later, Naruto had a pot of fresh tea, several plates of sushi, and onigiri waiting when Tenten and Roshi entered the kitchen. At this, Roshi arched an eyebrow and took a seat, while Tenten took a seat beside Naruto. As he made the connection, he briefly glanced between the two teenagers. He was understandably upset because he was a father, but he also knew Naruto well because of all the time he had spent assisting in the shop. He made the decision to control his temper until she listened to them. Roshi gave Naruto a look that, by all rights, should have sent him crashing into the wall. I don't want to know what you two do alone, but there is one thing I will know now, Naruto. Just what are your intentions towards Tenten? After a brief exchange of glances, Naruto put his hand on hers and gave her a comforting smile. When he saw that she had returned the smile, he turned to face Roshi and answered in a tone more appropriate for a meeting with the head of a clan. Roshi-san, I can assure you that my intentions toward Ten-chan are completely honorable, though it may seem rushed. I have asked if she would be willing to help me rebuild the Strife clan, and she has agreed. Having spent enough time with ninjas to understand some of the specifics involved in re-establishing a clan, Roshi was taken aback by this and narrowed his eyes as one of those details crossed his mind. I have a feeling there is more to this than you were saying. Naruto, I've been around enough ninja clans to know a few things, so please do us all a favor and stop pussyfooting around. Tenten squeezed Naruto's hand, making him smile back at her as he let out a sigh. Naruto took a deep breath before continuing, knowing that Roshi would probably disagree with what he was about to hear. I have already talked with Hokage-sama about restoring my clan, so you needn't worry about that. With Tenten's wonderful assistance, we have also made connections with some of the major ninja clans already with positive results. Granted, things are moving faster than I had planned, but I have never hid anything from her about restoring my clan. In case you haven't heard, I have a bloodline, and as such I am bound by the Clan Restoration Act, and will have to take at least 3 wives by the time I turn 19. Tenten and I have become very close over the last few months, as you know, and recently realized that we are more than just friends, and as such I have asked if she would be one of my wives. Naruto got up and approached Roshi before making a deep bow. Roshi-san, I humbly ask for your blessing in having you daughter's hand in marriage. Roshi took a moment to process the information, and even though he detested the thought of Tenten getting involved in clan politics, he had to acknowledge that she was capable of far worse than Naruto. He already viewed the boy as a nephew and, to be honest, he really liked him. He turned to face his daughter and saw the genuine affection she had for Naruto when she looked at him, along with the worry in her eyes. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled explosively before turning to face Naruto. To be perfectly honest, I think you are both too young for this, and I certainly don't like seeing Tenten caught up in the CRA, but I can see you two care for each other deeply. You have my blessing on 2 conditions. The first is that no more indecent behavior will happen in this house until you are properly married. Secondly, Roshi looked at them both with eyes as solid as steel. I do not want to be a grandfather until both of you are at the very least Chunin. Do I make myself clear? Tenten flushed as Naruto smiled sheepishly at being discovered and nodded in agreement with what they believed to be reasonable terms given the circumstances. After that, Naruto approached Tenten, gave her a kiss, and gave her a hug while Tenten was already considering what she would bring when she spent the night at Naruto's house and deciding to discuss contraceptive jutsu with some medic nin. Naruto was relieved that, which he believed to be the difficult part, the two lovers ended their passionate display when Roshi growled after the kiss had lasted for more than a minute. Roshi gave Naruto a stern look that implied his daughter was not on that list before leaving the kitchen. I'm heading back to the forge, but remember to keep the PDAs to a minimum, and since you are wearing a Hite, I assume you have much to do after graduating. Tenten barely made it to her team's morning training before the mission hall because of the events that had transpired that Saturday morning. Breathless from running full tilt from her house, she halted in front of her Jonin-sensei. Leaning on her knees, the team's Kunoichi was always early for team meetings and never skipped training unless it was absolutely necessary, so Guy wondered what was going on. Is something wrong, Tenten? You missed training this morning completely, and almost missed today's mission. Tenten paused to catch her breath, then responded, Guy-sensei, an emergency has come up, and I have to skip today's team activities. Guy became even more concerned as a result, and she expressed this. What has happened, and is there anything we can do to help? She hoped he wouldn't ask for an explanation right away because she was in a rush and didn't want to deal with her teammates' reactions when they learned she was engaged. I can't tell you right now, Guy-sensei, but if you could tell me where I could find Mitarashi Enko, it'd help a lot.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.